All right, what's up, everybody? So today I am going to be reviewing videos where people are talking about metaethics, about moral realism and moral anti-realism and that sort of thing. So let's get started. I will get started in 1 second. All right, just making a couple adjustments to things. All right, that one is good. And I did already check the sound, so everything should be working okay. So let's get into it. Today, I'm going to see how many videos I get through. I know that I give like an hour of commentary on 30 seconds of people talking. So it's possible that I'll just do one. I have 5 videos lined up. So I have a backlog of videos that I've wanted to review. I've been doing conscious stuff lately. So today is all about going over metaethics stuff. So I am going to be starting with a video that was just live a few hours ago, and that's on capturing Christianity. And Cameron had a guest on, Adam Lloyd Johnson, who I have seen before. I'm not sure where, maybe on that channel or another channel. And there's some discussion of moral realism and anti-realism. I mean, that's what the whole thing is about. So let me put that video up. And hopefully that'll work fine. All right. So this video was about, you could see from the title, why the moral argument isn't as bad as people think. And so you may or may not know, but the moral argument is an argument for the existence of God. And it typically will argue something along the lines of, if basically you need God for morality. So a standard argument would be something like, if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values don't exist, but objective moral values do exist, so God exists. So something like that. Oh, yeah, someone says nice background. So I've been experimenting with backgrounds, and that one is like Lovecraftian. It's inspired by my discussion yesterday with Pete Mandic, and I have a few more. So let me pop a few in here. Here's another Lovecraftian one. You could see the tentacles. But I think they're a little too vibrant. So I'm going to like hop onto canvas and like lower them to like 50% transparency or something like that, so that they jump out a little bit less and they're a little less glaring. Here's another Lovecraftian one. And I really like teal, so that one works well. And then you got this one. So for anybody that's just listening, and you can't really see that because I'm sharing the screen. If anyone's listening, you're not going to see these, but I'm also anticipating one. So I got an Easter one that I made. This is all stuff in Midjourney or GPT. I think Midjourney for all of these. You may have seen over the summer of last year, I had this tropical one, and it's fun when I have guests to, have a goofy background. So I've got this one, and I don't think it's too disruptive. So I think I'll keep it. I think I'll keep the Lovecraftian thing. All right. So yeah, I got those backgrounds going. I didn't realize that was on there. So I guess it felt like I had to address it because I thought I had switched it back to just the default. So yeah, I'll lower those so they're a little less like jumpy outy. In fact, I'll remove it. It's a little too distracting even for me. All right. There we go. No background. Okay. So, and let me just say hi to everybody too while I'm here. I still would like to do that. Sometimes when I have guests, I don't get a chance. So Sapir says, hello, Lance. So hey to you. Sully Sullivan is the one that commented on the background. And yeah, so, okay, some people saying a variety of things in the comments. Okay, be nice. All right. Okay, so I already checked the volume and it seemed okay, but let me check with you. How does this sound? In fact, what we'll do is I'll give the video a little lead leading up to the part that I want to comment on, and then I'll adjust the volume as we go. So go back about a minute. I'll give you some context anyway. So just let me know how that sounds. Of course, now it's not going to play. Oh, wow. All right. Give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. Of course, as soon as I stop sharing, then it started working.
Sort of unexplained arbitrary limits, whereas
already, so how's that sound?
Posit some like natural thing, it's going to have some finite limit in value and in power and stuff, and that's just gonna raise some little paradoxes and stuff. But I like how you're pointing out the similarities between the arguments, and this might actually be a good point to sort of plug your book here, right? That you've published not too long ago,
Little
Divine
low.
Love
Okay.
Theory.
Pop it up a
Why
little.
don't you talk about your book and some of the views that you've
Is that
outlined
better?
here, where you basically give an account of why God is the best account of axiology value.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, video a little less loud than me, but loud enough to be clearly heard. Okay. If I get a couple more votes, I get a yeah and a yeah. All right. Better. Okay, so I got one better.
Yeah, so maybe it's a little bit of history.
It's better to get this painful experience out of the way now, instead of having a whole with me at any rate 3-hour video where people are like, the volume is too different between the two of you.
Of the book, as I said.
All right, I'll crank it up just a tiny bit. Oh no, I'm getting better and thumbs up. Okay, we're gonna go with this. Volume is always an issue, especially because I have audio coming in from multiple sources at once, so that can make things a little complicated for me. And that also sounds a little low for me. Okay, should be good.
When I was working on my PhD and even in my master's degree, I was looking for ways to strengthen the moral argument because I found it other arguments more compelling. Wanted to work in this area, see if I could strengthen the moral argument.
And just so you know, I'm not reviewing the whole video. I'm just
I
reviewing
always
these parts.
approach the moral argument a little bit differently. I follow more of David Baggett's approach, if you're familiar with him, which is to say it's more of an abductive approach. So I would lay out the argument very simply a bit.
Yeah, so just for the record, so the standard moral argument that people employ a lot is the William Lane Craig version. It's a deductive argument. Baggett has this abductive argument, and this is not a bad thing, but you could say that the argument is a weaker argument. That doesn't mean it's a worse argument. So there's a context in which like weaker can mean like a worse argument. The argument you could say maybe is more modest. It's not attempting to show that because the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. It's an argument that says, hey, given some set of considerations, the best explanation is God, and those considerations would include certain sorts of claims about the nature of morality. So something like that. So we'll just hear what he has to say about that.
Differently than the way that you have following Craig's example. I would start out with premise one, saying that there are objective moral truths. Premise two, God seems to be the best explanation for these objectives.
So you have this, in this case, the observation or the data that you're supposed to explain is the fact that moral realism is true. So that if you're worried, oh, this is question begging or something, this is not question begging, because this is not an argument for moral realism. This is an argument for the existence of God. And so if you start by saying, okay, let's start out by saying we grant that moral realism is true. Now we need an explanation for that. And then this argument is supposed to say the best explanation for that is the existence of God. Of course, that doesn't mean you can't challenge the first premise.
Objective moral truths. Therefore, conclusion number three, we have good reason to believe that there is, in fact, a God. So it's more of an abductive approach, following David Baggett's lead in this. It's an inference to the best explanation. And I like that approach better than, let's say, a more deductive approach that Craig often uses. So in my work in the moral argument, I always felt that the first premise was the most difficult premise to argue for. And
so notice the first premise being the premise that moral realism is true.
The first premise being that there are objective moral truths. Because that premise, it's different, right, than the first cause or design arguments that usually begin with some sort of, you could say a scientific phenomenon, right, or some phenomenon in physical reality, if you will, right? The universe is fine-tuned, the universe has a cause, there's something like that. But with the moral argument, you're starting with something that's a bit more abstract and something that might be more difficult to prove because you can't really, you can't do a scientific experiment on love or justice, morality. And so it seems like that first premise I've always thought is the most difficult premise to argue for. And it seems like if somebody is going to believe in objective morality, it's going to be almost more of a self-evident, intuitive, just grasping this, almost like when you see the equation 2 + 2 = 4. It's like, no, I don't really have to do any sort of proof of that or evidence of that because it's.
So you see, this is one of the common positions that people will take about moral realism, that is, the facts are self-evident, that you just grasp them. And the thing about that is, I never really buy these comparisons to something like mathematics. And part of the reason for that is that mathematics, now I grant that there's like theoretical stuff in mathematics that might be hard to apply, but mathematics doesn't seem to me like something that is so top down and from our heads to the world. There is so much feedback about the way in which we apply at least a great deal of mathematics, where the world tells us, hey, our about doing mathematics comports with or allows us to utilize that information to achieve things reliably in the world. And if it didn't, we wouldn't use that type of mathematics. We'd either have to change it up or abandon using math. So it's at least somewhat similar in a lot of the sort of more conventional cases to the kinds of facts that would be empirical. If our scientific theories didn't allow us to achieve our goals, we probably wouldn't employ those theories. They give us feedback. This is a point that I make about how we would know whether we were good at chess. One way you find out you're good at chess is you play people that claim to be better at chess and see if you win. If you keep beating them, yeah, you're probably pretty good at chess. Now, maybe that some of those people are just liars or they don't know how bad they are. But, if you find information that suggests someone's a chess master and you beat them 10 out of 10 games, okay, you're probably pretty good at chess. And, engineering, if you're good at building buildings, the buildings stay up. The buildings don't crumble and fall apart. They don't have massive problems. So a lot of applied forms of knowledge, the world itself will, in a sense, tell you whether that knowledge works. At least that's a very pragmatic approach that I take to these sorts of things. And at least a great deal of mathematics can be and is similarly applied, and it works. That isn't to say that there isn't a bunch of theoretical mathematics that it's not clear what, if any, practical applications it may have. But in that sense, there's this sort of feedback from the world, and I'm not sure that you get that with morality. If someone simply says, I don't care about what the supposed moral facts are that people today think the moral facts are, and they just do whatever they want, the world itself doesn't give them any feedback. People might give them feedback, but to me, I think that just illustrates how this stuff is best viewed as social and intersubjective, and better understood as ways in which people are prompted to react to one another based on their values, their preferences, their beliefs. And that could include beliefs about what the moral facts are, but it's the beliefs doing the work, not the facts themselves. I see some comments here. Yeah, so someone's saying 2 + 2 = 4 is a tautology. Morals aren't that. I mean, someone could argue that they are, or they could argue that they're self-evident, or they could argue that there's certain sorts of fundamental moral considerations that from which one can derive a whole bunch of implications or entailments that would be true given those axioms. There's a whole bunch of ways someone might argue that these moral facts are a priori facts, and they are just as much true as any other sorts of facts that one could acquire via a priori means. So I don't think that they're going to just grant that there's a disanalogy between math and morality if that disanalogy would deprive them of the epistemic resources they use to judge that there are moral facts in the first place. It's possible, though. So it's possible someone could be really convinced that there've got to be these moral facts, but they just don't think there's a way of knowing about them. That'd be a pretty unusual position, but it is possible. Typically a moral skeptic, or you could say metaethical skeptic, if we want to be super clear, is someone that believes it's not possible to have moral knowledge. And that's at least compatible with the belief that there are moral facts, we just can't know about them. But I've never heard of anybody that thinks that. They think, yeah, there's these inaccessible moral facts and we just can't know about them, just too bad. And that's a pretty bad state of affairs. There's all these facts and you can't know about them. Typically, moral skeptics, I would surmise, would either believe there are no moral facts and that we can't know about them, or we can't know about the moral facts. Maybe there are some, maybe there aren't. They don't know. So they would be agnostic. So, but maybe there's a skeptic out there that thinks that there are moral facts. All right. Just looking to see if there's any. Yeah. So Nidhi asks, it's independent. Am I correct above? Maybe, maybe not. I don't think it would just be something that you could just assert. It would be something that you would have to dispute. All right.
Self-evident. And morality seems to be like that for the vast majority of people.
That's what made me want to listen to this. Now listen to that all the way through to that point.
It's going to be almost a more of a self-evident, intuitive, just grasping this, almost like when you see the equation 2 + 2 = 4. It's like, no, I don't really have to do any sort of evidence of that because it's just self-evident.
Now notice that's something along the lines of ethical intuitionism. It's at the very least, this isn't like some naturalistic view of morality. This is a view that there's some sort of special access that we have to the moral facts. And it's this access that has this self-evident quality, this intuitive quality. The moral facts disclose themselves to us in some distinctive sort of way that would be very different from, discovering like the periodic, like features of the periodic table, or discovering that evolution is true. In science, it's not like that. There's a different epistemic pathway to these sorts of facts. Now, given all that, watch what he says next.
And morality seems to be like that for the vast majority of people.
Morality seems to be like that for the vast majority of people. Now, you know what I'm going to say about this? That's an empirical claim. Now, as I've been over, I've reviewed this many, many times on this channel. There just isn't good evidence that that's true. So people will make these claims. In this case, it's not even just that people are committed to realism or they speak like realists. This is a much more robust claim, which is that not only do people have these, an inclination towards realism, but they have this like ethical intuitionistic inclination towards realism. And he says the vast majority of people. Where's the evidence for that? So, as I've discussed, I'll give a brief summary. There is a small empirical literature on the psychology of metaethics. Almost all of the studies that touch on this subject have been conducted in the past 20 years. There's almost no research prior to that. There are a few studies that explicitly and directly address this question that are older than 20 years old. There's now one that has just passed that mark. There's Nichols and Folds Bennett from 2003. There's also an older study from the 1980s. There's also the Forsyth Ethics Position Questionnaire, which some people have appealed to as evidence for people's metaethical beliefs. I don't take it to be a valid measure of people's metaethical views, and I don't think it was intended or constructed to be that way. I discuss that more in my work, why that's not a valid measure of whether people are realists or anti-realists, and why it's not even really, it wasn't even designed to really address that question, at least not in the way, not in a way that comports with contemporary ways of categorizing and drawing distinctions. So it's not a particularly useful scale for that. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the scale. It's used for other purposes. So some people have appealed to research on the moral conventional distinction, which is supposed to be research showing that from an early age, children reliably distinguish moral from non-moral norms, and that some of the ways in which they do so is they attribute authority independence to the moral norms. That is, they think that the moral norms couldn't be overridden by an authority. Not particularly good evidence that the vast majority of people are moral realists. Why? Well, because subsequent research has shown that this predisposition is not culturally universal. Subsequent research has shown that these distinctions break down at the margins, that you don't always get this clustering of the moral versus non-moral distinctions. And also it's arguable whether, hey, could a teacher or the principal of the school override a moral rule? No. Well, then that means it stands independently true. I'm an anti-realist. Do you think if you told me, hey, if your political leaders decided it's okay to, do something horrible, then it is okay? Of course I would say no, because my moral standards aren't contingent on what authorities say. That doesn't mean that I think that their stance independently true. So that paradigm was not designed to tell whether people were moral realists or not, or if it was, it doesn't do a very good job of it. So, and also it's not universal. And also those distinctions they break down anyway. So some people have appealed to older psychological research. None of that research is good evidence that people are predisposed towards moral realism, much less the vast majority of people. The newer research likewise does not show that. The newer research has significant methodological shortcomings. So some of the early studies like Goodwin and Darley, 2008, one of the paradigms they use is just not a valid measure of whether people are moral realists or not. And the reason for that is that the researchers mixed up cognitivism with realism. So one of their ways of asking the question, they ask if a moral claim is true, false, or just an opinion. It's not a measure of realism. That's a measure of cognitivism. And also, like, what does it mean, an opinion? So opinion is an ambiguous term. Sometimes it's used to refer to propositional claims about what's objectively true or false. Sometimes it's used to refer to subjective claims. My opinion, this cake is delicious. And it could be used sometimes expressively. So we don't really know, because it would be an empirical question how people tend to use the term opinion. But it at least seems to me, and I suspect it seems to most people, that we could point to very clear instances in which it's used in ways that are consistent with a realist view and inconsistent with a realist view. It's not a good term to use in a study because of the ambiguity. So they use that measure. It's not a valid measure. And then there are big problems with their other measures. That doesn't mean these aren't cool studies. These studies, they got a lot of things right about these studies, but ultimately, I don't think that these early studies can really tell us whether the vast majority of people are moral realists or not. Here's the thing, though. Even if we assume all of that empirical research was like the best research ever conducted, it's super reliable and it's all accurate, correct. Well, what's it telling us? Well, it's telling us that college students in the United States and people that fill out surveys in the United States, at best, have high rates of endorsing moral realism. At best. It doesn't actually, that's questionable. But even assuming best case scenario, that's the most you would know, that like college students and people that fill out surveys online in the US, those people are inclined towards realism. Best case scenario. People in general think about morality? No, not so much. And as I've also pointed out many times, we also have a bunch of research now, this research on this, based on this idea of like WEIRD, the Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. This is an acronym that is used to capture the fact that the vast majority of psychological research, experimental research in psychology, has been conducted on a demographically narrow population. They only make up about 12% of the world's population, but they make up the vast majority of the studies. And then something like 99% of researchers are like doing this research in the Western world. So you have this really culturally parochial conception of morality that it is being characterized both by the researchers conducting the research and in terms of the participants that are participating in this research. And so we literally don't have sufficient cross-cultural data to know whether most people are moral realists or not. Even if we had really valid measures, and even if 100% of the participants in every study agreed with moral realism so far, we still wouldn't be in a position to say the vast majority of people are moral realists, unless we had good antecedent reasons or evidence to think that this is a particular type of psychological issue that if we find it in one population, it's going to generalize to other populations. And we don't have that. So we're just not in a position to make these sorts of claims. And yet people just make them anyway. And it's kind of baffling. I don't understand why they do it. Part of it might be that they don't know that the psychology, like, there's might be a number of issues. Basically, people might overestimate their ability to make, to generalize based on their personal experiences and anecdotes. People may not be aware of this research. People may think that the methods that they're using give them some special insight into reality. So if you're an intuitionist, as long as you think that everybody everywhere has similar rational faculties, they're going to converge on the same conclusions. This isn't going to be that much a matter of cultural variation. So, would I expect people in other cultures to converge on, the Pythagorean theorem? Yes. That's not going to be surprising. Am I going to expect them to invent exactly the same games as us, like chess? No, because that's much more culturally contingent. And so if you think that the kinds of the intellectual faculties that we use to arrive at our judgments about morality are not something that are so culturally contingent, then you're not going to think it's very plausible that we would find this variation. And so you might conclude, yeah, if I got these faculties, everybody else has these faculties, they're going to think the same thing. And that might be probably the biggest disagreement here, is that I don't think that philosophers or people in general have some sort of culturally transcendent, language transcendent, special intellectual faculty for detecting truths of this kind. And if they think they have that faculty, they're welcome to present evidence of it.
And so a lot of people do agree with that first premise. They think that there are objective moral truths.
Now that's an okay claim. A lot of people agree with that. I agree. A lot of people agree with that, but a lot of people is like a lot of people relative to what standard. So a lot of people in academic philosophy, absolutely. And I think that's where he goes with this next. A lot of people having these discussions explicitly, absolutely. So we'll get to that.
And so if somebody is already on board with that first premise, then I think the second premise is very strong. I think the second premise, that God is the best explanation for objective moral truth, I think that is a very, very strong premise. But if somebody doesn't hold to objective moral truth to begin with, I think the moral argument has a difficult job of getting off the ground, so to speak, of beginning. And so that's what kind of drew me into the conversation. And very soon, very quickly, as I started to do research and kind of canvassed the scene of who was saying what, discovered Eric Wielenberg, and
there's some more interesting claims here. I don't know if I should
come to find out he already accepts premise one. So that made my job a little bit easier. He already accepts that there is objective moral truth, but then disagrees with the second premise. He doesn't think God's the best explanation for that objective moral truth. And so that drew me in because I wanted to defend premise two. I thought that was a much stronger premise, and began a series of writing against Wielenberg and pushing back against his theory. And he wrote some of the stuff that I put together, some of my...
Let's pause so I can look at some comments. I see a few people saying hello here. So Anne asks, what do you say to those who say the moral facts are obvious through the outcomes they produce? I would have to hear more about that to know what exactly they're claiming. Let's see. Okay, just people talking to each other. It's fine.
Work got published. He read it. We started interacting. A very super nice guy. He gave me great feedback and started pushing back on my theory. And as a Christian, I just thought, my theory was simple. God's the best explanation of morality. But as he started pushing back on my theory, I realized that, it needs to be more nuanced than that. And that's what led me to develop my own theory of exactly how God is the source and foundation of morality. And that is what I call my divine love theory. So the book is a compare contrast, my theory, my divine love theory, my explanation of objective morality compared and contrast with Eric Wielenberg's, arguing that mine is the better explanation. And he's read the book. He wrote an endorsement on the back cover of the book, which I really appreciated. He disagrees, obviously, with my conclusion, but as you can read on the endorsement, it says that it's good work and people should take it seriously. And I really appreciated him writing that endorsement for the book.
Well, let's get into your compare and contrast of your theory versus Eric's theory, which I think is becoming more and more
There's going to be some more
popular. Like people are sort of gravitating, or at least naturalists and stuff.
Move on to the next video if I actually can make it to it.
But let's first back up a little bit and talk about that first premise, because a lot of ethicists, my first premise, I mean the premise that objective morality is real, right? So there's a lot of ethicists right now that are accepting this, and this is not just theists, it's atheists as well. It's becoming, I think, the majority position currently, actually, in So let's discuss some of the reasons why ethicists are being more and more drawn to objective morality in the first.
Okay, so Cameron states that it's becoming the majority position, and that's true, and it's probably been true for quite some time. We do not have, to my knowledge, and I'm pretty confident we just don't have this information, any sort of statistics. Like, I don't think anybody was doing like Gallup polls or whatever on academic philosophers until fairly recently. We have the 2009 philpapers survey and the 2020 philpapers survey. If you're not familiar with philpapers, it's a website where philosophers can post their work, and it's like a archive. You can aggregate work there. They post jobs, they post conference stuff. So it's basically the one-stop place to go for everything philosophy related. And Bourget and Chalmers from this, I don't know what other role they have there, but they ran a survey, associated with philpapers, and they gathered a bunch of data. And the survey, that they do their best to gather data from like a good sample of people, but there's always issues when you're sampling. You can't perfectly sample everybody, so there's going to be large portions of the world that are not that they don't reach. So I think it in the last survey, I think it was 48% people from the United States. So it's not going to be the most representative sample of like all philosophers. So you do have that potential issue, which is that it's not like a a snapshot of what every philosopher thinks. It's an attempt to get to, you make inferences about what you think most philosophers think based off of this. And it's mostly analytic philosophers. And then there's going to be questions about the degree to which the people that were sampled and that responded to the survey are representative of people that didn't. And there's always going to be issues with that. It's just a question of the degree of representativeness. Now, that being said, the 2009 survey, I believe that the proportion that endorsed moral realism was 59.4%. The proportion that endorsed it in the 2020 field paper survey was 62%. That number bumps up to about 65% if you look at people that specialize in metaethics. The people that specialize in metaethics were actually a extraordinarily large proportion of the total sample. From my point of view, it was 13% of philosophers said that they specialize in metaethics, which seems like a huge number to me. And I believe for that particular sample, it was 228 respondents specialized in metaethics. So that's what you're looking at. And that sounds like a lot of people in metaethics. I don't know. I can't name 228 people in metaethics. So it's a lot of people comparatively speaking. So, but, when we're talking about people that are moral realists, I think that it's a bunch of, most philosophers probably take a stance on it. And you could look at the data for people that say stuff like, because one of your options when you're filling out the survey is like insufficiently familiar to answer. And I don't think they had too many of that for this particular issue. So most philosophers take a stance, and then people kind of like in the orbit of philosophers, people that read this stuff but are not academic philosophers, people that get a bachelor's degree in philosophy or people that watch this channel will tend to have stances on these things. But I don't tend to think most people do. But of the people that think about this, it's an open question. If we zoom in on the people that responded to this particular survey, yeah, a majority favored moral realism. Now, I get a little frustrated when people say stuff like a vast majority. I don't know how they, it's like the thing about, you catch a fish and it keeps getting larger and larger. Like how does, at 62% is not a vast majority. That's a little silly to say that. And it's not a consensus. So people will sometimes say the consensus favors moral realism. I mean, unless they're using consensus very loosely, it strikes me as a little misleading. Anyway.
First place, before we get to comparing and contrasting these theories of objective morality.
Yeah, no, that's good. And you're exactly right. It is becoming the majority position, at least among academic professional philosophers. It might not be the majority position at the popular level yet, but definitely among academic atheist philosophers, it is now the majority position. And you go back, 40, 30, 40, 50 years, and what was really in vogue was postmodernism, subjective morality, relativism, right? I got my undergrad at the University of Nebraska in the 90s, and I remember so many of my professors talking about relative morality and pushing that very hard. But
I think that this is pretty much true, or probably true. It's the impression I get from looking at the way that moral realists were framing their views in the 1980s and 1990s. Is they would start papers off. I'm trying to think. I think it was a naturalist. Was it Boyd? Somebody did it where they're like, I know this is a view that is very unpopular, but so I remember a realist paper from the 1980s like that. And the impression I get from people that have been in the field is that in the middle of the 20th century, moral realism was not a very popular position. You had the rise of positivism, which had been starting to fade out towards the latter half. And you had basically the expressivists. I don't know how many people in academic philosophy were relativists in particular, but then you also had Mackey come along with error theory, and so you had the sort of the emergence of the contemporary landscape of anti-realist positions, and anti-realism seems to have been the dominant view. But again, we don't have data on that, and that started to recede. I don't know exactly when, and I wasn't around. So someone that's been in the field for a long time and knows everybody would probably have a good sense, but it looks like the tide started to turn maybe around the 1980s. I'm mostly speculating here, just from what I'm seeing in the literature, that you started to see some realist accounts begin to emerge at Cornell realism, and basically these naturalist accounts started coming out. And then shortly thereafter, in the 1990s, you started seeing the sort of resurgence of non-naturalist realism. And that seems to have enjoyed a lot of growth. So I think a lot of this might also be coinciding with a decline in confidence in naturalism and physicalism. What I think might be happening, and there's people that would know way better than me. I should find some to have on as a guest. It looks to me like there's been some move towards positions sort of blurring together. They get so similar, it's hard to tell the difference. This is what it looks like it's happened with expressivist views. So you have the early sort of non-cognitivism stuff like emotivism. Moral claims are like boo stealing or whatever. The neo-expressivist accounts, they tend to sort of import these features that allow them to make sense of people speaking in ways that look more propositional without endorsing that they're like the sorts of metaphysics that realists tend to favor. So you get these accounts with deflationary theories of truth, and they incorporate other sorts of features. And the expressivist accounts have sort of butted up against realist accounts to where it's unclear what ways people speak or think, where they really make different predictions, or they would say, we should expect this to be different. So a lot of those accounts end up sort of looking like realist accounts. Now, I'm not a fan of these accounts, largely because I don't share the motivations that they have, which is to try to do justice to the supposedly realist seeming features of ordinary moral language. I both don't think that the methods that they're using, the appropriate methods. I think that these are empirical questions. And why would I want to vindicate or do justice to realist presuppositions? I don't have the intuitions. I think that the intuitions are better explained by psychological explanations. I don't think that they generalize, and I don't think that they're universal. I think this is distinctive to the way that philosophers, or at least people in the Western world, are more disposed to think. So I think that there's a lot of reasons to just not be all that excited about the project that they're engaged in. And this is another case where I'm wondering whether there's sort of this like triple split kind of thing, where some people are moving towards the middle, and then the extreme sides are sort of, running off into their different directions and getting even more extreme. So basically you have this big middle, and then you get the sides are sort of splitting, kind of like this big, it's the socio-philosophical trident, to come with, if that makes sense. That's how I'm visualizing it. But I don't know if that's true. This is my very rough impression of what's going on. All right.
But the tides are changing.
Yeah, so Sci-Fi Sapien says, like pseudo-realism. Yeah, the position is actually called quasi-realism. So like one version of these accounts, and the primary proponent of that is Simon Blackburn. And yeah, it actually is called quasi-realism, that particular view. All right.
Changing. And what's happened now is the vast majority do affirm that there are objective moral truths.
You see, vast majority, 62% is not a vast majority.
And I think it's because it's just so much more intuitive. It's so hard to consistent.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. The fact that 62% are endorsing moral realism. So, and who knows whether there were sampling differences or other reasons why, if you see people move from 56% to 62%, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's been an increase. Like in, samples vary, they're noisy. So it may be that there's an increase. I actually think that there is an increase. As much as I don't want there to be an increase, I suspect that there is. I suspect that the momentum is currently behind realists, and it's especially behind non-naturalist realists. That's my suspicion. So basically, like my primary opponents, I think that they are currently winning the battle in terms of total numbers among academic philosophers. Now, Cameron's question, and this response is supposed to be an explanation for like why they're all being convinced of realism. But that, okay, if I, so I'm trying to give an intuitive explanation of selection effects, but I'll just try to give an explanation instead of some metaphor. Here's a possibility. It could be that, the turnover rate in philosophy, people aren't always responding to these surveys. People retire, unfortunately, people die, and younger generations become philosophers. And so if you're measuring people at 10-year intervals, you're not measuring exactly the same people. People change. And it could be that a whole bunch of factors are causing realists to be more likely to become philosophers. And then when you look at the survey, you're just seeing there's a change in the people, the population that you're sampling from. And that explains why there's an increase. It does not mean simply because the number has gone up that it's gone up because of the strength of the arguments or the quality of the reasons or anything like that. That just doesn't, that may be an explanation, but there are other explanations, and selection effects are one of them.
Believe in that morality is just purely subjective. That's very.
So notice here what the implied, the notion here is the implication is that your options are realism or subjectivism. And those aren't your only options. I am an anti-realist. I'm not a subjectivist. Most of the anti-realists I've seen are some type of expressivist or error theorist. I haven't seen a whole lot of subjectivists or, some kind of constructivist or something like that. which, maybe that includes some of the relativist positions. And there are a few out there. So you have David Wong's relativism, which is, by the way, it's discussed, and I think I'm a little past halfway. Yeah, I'm I don't know, 60-70% of the way through the book by Matt Lutz, the Spencer case, called Is Morality Real? And I'll probably be writing or doing something about that, because, if I'm going to read that whole book on metaethics, I want to say something about it. So I'm reading that book now, and they bring up Wong's position in there. And it's a really cool and interesting position. I'm not going to get into that now. That's a digression. And I would want to go sit down and really read more of it, and if I wanted to talk about it more, but it's a cool position. But yeah, your options are not realism, subjectivism. There's more options available to anti-realists.
Very difficult to hold on to that consistently.
So let me take it back a bit, because I was interrupting the video a bit.
Is postmodernism,
and
subjective morality, relativism, right? I got my undergrad at the University of Nebraska in the 90s, and I remember so many of my professors talking about relative morality and pushing that very hard. But the tides are changing, and what's happened now is the vast majority do affirm that there are objective moral truths. And I think it's because it's just so much more intuitive. It's so hard to consistently believe in that morality is just purely subjective. It's very, very difficult to hold on to that consistently. It's one thing to sit in a college classroom and kind of postulate about it, but then to live it out in reality, it's very, very difficult to be consistent.
So this is, as a general point, I like the kind of point being made. And even though I very, 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 very strongly disagree with what's being said here, the general point might be something, it fits a pattern or a template. And the template would be, when a person puts on their philosopher's hat and they do philosophy, they can end up endorsing all sorts of positions that may or may not have practical implications. And let's suppose they do have practical implications, and those practical implications are wildly out of accord with making decisions in everyday life. So someone is like, I really believe that there is no way to predict events in the future. Okay, well, if that was true, that's going to make it very difficult for that person to make decisions if they lived consistently with, you can't make any predictions at all. Are they going to buy tickets to go anywhere? How would they make predictions about whether they'd be able to go or not? Or someone says it's impossible to make decisions. They're probably going to end up making decisions at some point. So there are philosophical positions a person could adopt where they carry practical implications, and the person may find themselves inevitably acting in ways inconsistent with the practical implications that are entailed by the philosophical position. And that general template of an objection is, I think, a good one, which is to say, you when you're in your intellectual mode, can think whatever you want and say, I believe this, I believe that, but we could go and look at your behavior and see if it's consistent with it. Now, here's the thing. Is there any actual problem of living consistently as a subjectivist? Well, it depends. Are we talking about appraiser or agent subjectivism? You think that each person sort of determines the rightness or wrongness of their own actions. And so what that would mean is that if someone else thinks it's okay to steal your stuff, then it is okay for them to steal your stuff from your point of view. So if they come up to you, they say, give me all your stuff, then too bad for me. I guess I got to give them all my stuff. So that's a really weird type of relativism. I like to call it a la carte realism. And the reason I like to call it a la carte realism is not that it's a form of realism. It is, in fact, a form of anti-realism. And the reason it's a form of anti-realism is because the moral facts are fixed by people's stances. If it's your stance that it's okay to steal from people, then it is okay to steal from people. And your attitude that it's okay to steal from people makes it true that it's okay for you to steal from people. When your attitude makes it true, that's a stance-dependent theory. There are moral facts, but those moral facts are stance-dependent. They're not stance-independent. And remember, moral realism is the view that moral facts are stance-independent. So agent relativism is a type of anti-realism. No question about that. But look at how it operates in practice. How it operates in practice is that if someone else thinks it's okay to steal from you, this actually furnishes you with it foists an obligation onto you, such that you now have obligations to act in certain ways that are binding on you, independent of your own desires, of your own goals and values. What does that seem to you in practice a lot like? Seems like moral realism. It seems like there are these facts about what you should or shouldn't do, and they are not determined by your attitudes, your goals, your values, or those of your culture. They're from outside, and they're imposed on you, and you, in a certain sense, have to comply with them. You have a reason to comply with him. Now, that to me has all the hallmarks of the suspicious features, or some of the main suspicious features that I reject in moral realism. And it's because they have this sort of, it's trying to, it's a view which holds that there's some sort of authority that dictates what I should or shouldn't do that doesn't ultimately turn on my own goals and desires. So when I go about deciding things, I act in accordance with my goals and desires. I don't care for the sake of it what another person's desires are. Now, I do care about other people's goals and values. I want people to live good lives and be happy, but I don't think that their desires like create obligations that I am bound to comply with independent of my desires. I value their desires, and that is why I care about their desires, because I value them. If someone had desires I didn't value, I wouldn't value those desires, and I would have zero interest in complying with them. So if someone desired to like set everything on fire or turn the universe into potatoes, I don't want that to happen. So I would try to stop them. And I'm not an agent relativist. So if they came up to me and said, well, you have to, because I think it's good, then it is good. So you have to care about that. I don't have to. No, I don't. I don't care about them. They're like universal potato theory or whatever. So I would just not comply with that. I don't want to. In short, if you have this like something like a Humean view of motivation, and you think people act in accordance to their goals and desires, that's roughly or approximately what my view is. I don't think my desires give me reasons. So some people add a bunch of metaphysical mumbo jumbo to their views. A lot of analytic philosophers. I don't do that. My view is more reductivist, quietist, or eliminativist, depending on the case. I don't think my desires give me reasons. I think there are locutions that you could use that I think reify or add these metaphysical stuff I wouldn't want to add, or add this actual extra conceptual stuff that I wouldn't want to add. I see that as analytic fluff that I don't accept. That being said, what you could see about the agent relativist position is that some of what I find objectionable about it is ironically that it functions a lot like moral realism, that it ends up furnishing facts about what you have to do. So basically, if other people want to do bad stuff, you have to be okay with that in these views. Here's the problem. That's not the only type of subjectivism. There's also appraiser subjectivism. And the appraiser subjectivist says that you judge actions according to whoever's evaluating the action. Now, oftentimes people are evaluating their own actions. So if a person wants to steal and thinks it's okay to steal, and they say it's okay to steal, the statement "it's okay to steal" on this view means that relative to that person's standards, it's okay to steal. Okay, but I am under no obligation to care about or honor what that person thinks is okay. I act in accordance with what I think is okay. And the appraiser subjectivist can have views about how everyone ought to act. So if you're an appraiser subjectivist, you could think something like, generally speaking, people shouldn't steal. Maybe there's emergencies or whatever. This view, like any other view, including realism, can be sensitive to context. And there could be situations where it's permissible or even good to steal. It might be good to steal, dangerous weapons from a dangerous person that is intent on using them. But the appraiser relativist is not obligated to care about other people's standards. Now, if you're an appraiser relativist, if you're a moral realist and you believe you have a set of moral facts, right? So here are the moral facts. As a moral realist, what you do or what do you think is good to do? Comply with those facts. And then you go about your life and you try your best to do so. If you're a subjectivist, you have a set of appraiser subjectivist, you have a set of moral standards. It could be exactly the same. And let's just suppose it is. It's exactly the same value. So the realist thinks these are the moral facts. And the subjectivist, the appraiser subjectivist says, these are my moral values. I ought to comply with them. And what do? They do their best to comply with them. In other words, they act exactly like the realist. So there is no difficulty. When I say no difficulty, I mean zero difficulty relative to realists for an appraiser subjectivist in complying with their moral facts. There's nothing inconsistent about it. It's not internally contradictory. It doesn't lead them with any deliberative challenges. It doesn't lead them with any explanatory challenges. It doesn't lead them with any practical difficulties. So what realists will often do is they'll frame, you've got realism on the one hand, doesn't have any problems, or anti-realism, and then you're stuck like you have to tolerate people doing terrible things, you have to be okay with people stealing from you, and that's just not true. It would only be true on this really weird construal of relativism that there's no most relativists probably wouldn't endorse it. I don't know, open question. And then you have all these other anti-realist positions. You have error theorists, you have non-cognitivists, you have people like myself who reject the whole trichotomy of anti-realist positions. You have the constructivist views. So you have a wide variety of options to choose from. And the bottom line is that moral realists simply just radically underestimate the conceptual resources available to anti-realists to address practical questions about how to live their lives. There's this constant vacillation between the theoretical issues, the abstract metaethical issues, and the practical issues. And there's a constant implication that anti-realists are saddled with all these huge practical problems. And it's just a bunch of nonsense. It's just not true. It's just not true. Okay.
And so I think a lot of these academic philosophers have just realized it makes a lot more sense that there are just objective moral truths. And a lot of it, I think, too, comes with the cultural tides that we're experiencing, where people are really fired up about certain moral issues, whether that be racism or oppression. But I think there's a realization that, look, we can't be fired up about these things if they're just subjective opinions.
Look at that. Let's take this back. This remark really stood out to me too. I'll take it back a few seconds.
Comes with the cultural tides that we're experiencing, where people are really fired up about certain moral issues, whether that be racism or oppression. But I think there's a realization that, look, we can't be fired up about these things if they're just subjective opinion.
Why couldn't you be fired up about something if it's just a subjective opinion? Notice the language there, just a subjective opinion. People are fired up about anime. People are fired up about their favorite foods. People are fired up about music. Why can't you be fired up? People are fired up about soccer games, sports. People get fired up about things that are just their subjective opinions. This notion that, and also flip it over to the realist stuff. Why would you be fired up about stance-independent objective facts? Why? Why are you fired up about those? They're so removed from us. They're these facts floating out there in the universe, and you could figure them out with your intellectual faculties. Okay, whatever. I don't care about that. I want to eat like a good taco or something. Like I want to have good food. I want to enjoy my life. And of course that involves moral concerns. But the reason I care about the moral concerns is because they're mine. They're my values. Like the subjectivity is why I care about them. So I actually think that this completely flips on its head. I'm only passionate about stuff that I subjectively care about. I don't even know what it would be like to be fired up about something that I subjectively don't care about. Like the idea of fired up to me almost just conceptually involves an important subjective element. I mean, if you're a subjectivist, okay, so if you're a subjectivist and you have certain moral values, okay, those values are an extension of or entailment of what it is you care about. They like literally are constitutive of what your concerns are. They're what you value. If you're a realist, what's the connection there? So there are these objective facts. Okay, well, subjectively, do you value those facts? Okay, well, if you did, then if you took the realism away, wouldn't you still care about them anyway? Or is it just that the realist is like, okay, whatever the moral facts are, that's what I care about. So if the moral facts were different, then you would care about those different moral facts. You see what I'm saying? Like, what if the moral facts were stuff like do terrible things, set things on fire, turn everything into potatoes? Now, some realists will respond, well, that it's necessary. The moral facts are necessary, so that couldn't be true. Whoa. If they're like logically necessary or something like that, okay, conditional on you being correct given your epistemic practices. Yeah, sure, whatever the moral facts are, if you want to say that they're necessary, then they're necessarily whatever they are. But it still seems like an epistemic possibility that the moral facts could be these horrible things, unless you think you have some sort of unless you think you have infallible access or it's self-evident, you could make those sorts of claims, and then things would get complicated. I'm not going to say that couldn't possibly work, but I personally, and again, my personal puzzlement about this is not itself an argument for why this couldn't be the case, but I think about this and there's a lot are constituted by or involve my subjective values, and that connection to me seems so natural. And then when you talk about like realist conceptions of things, they seem almost by design disconnected from what we care about or what we value. Now, someone could argue if you're a naturalist or you have some teleological account, maybe there's ways in which there is a sense in which the things that would constitute a good life or what we should or shouldn't do are in certain important ways connected to what we care about or what would be good for us or whatever, in ways that would matter to us on reflection, maybe. But the non-naturalist realist accounts to me really seem to sever the connection between our direct sort of concerns with what the world is like and what these moral facts are like.
These things have to be objectively true. Otherwise, they're not going to hold water. So I'm thankful for this shift, right? And there's good arguments. We can get into them if you'd like, but there's good thought experiments and arguments that morality is objectively true. Moral realism might be the more appropriate philosophical term. And there's some good work I could pull off the shelf, even by atheists who make excellent
I don't know if there's more to
arguments for
review
moral
here. We
realism.
might be done with this one.
Yeah, one of the arguments that I actually really like for moral realism
this
is
is
basically the
stuff.
connection between epistemic duties and moral duties. So like, and this is going to appeal, I think, to those of you that are watching that are more skeptically minded. I think most people, or a lot of skeptics, I'll say, have this intuition that we have duties when it comes to our intellect, and think like we've got to basically, if we want to hold some belief, we've got to have evidence for it. For example, like that's one of the sort of epistemic rules that exists for forming like good, reliable beliefs, okay, or justified beliefs. So, but what a lot of ethicists have pointed out is that if you think that there are these sort of epistemic duties where you've got to basically do certain things in order to be justified in your belief, if you've got to do things, then the same is, I think, going to apply to moral beliefs, because in a lot of the same ways, like there's just a ton of similarities between our thoughts about the epistemic realm and our thoughts about the moral realm. So maybe I can now pass it over to you and kind of maybe help me explain this idea a little bit better. And
so what Cameron is alluding to here is a companions and guilt argument. One of the most prominent proponents of this is Terence Cuneo. And basically these arguments function in this way where they have this parity premise, and then they appeal to the supposed realism of some other normative domain. And you put those two together, and then it's supposed to show that if you're an anti-realist about morality, you're stuck with this dilemma that either you have to accept anti-realism in other normative domains, or you have to give up your anti-realism about morality. And it works roughly like this. You would say something like this. Look, if the rationale behind this might be something like the same sorts of reasons and considerations for why you would be a moral anti-realist apply to other normative domains. And then typically proponents of these arguments would give you a particular normative domain that they think or hope that the anti-realist about morality will find appealing. The one Cuneo uses is epistemic norms. So this would be norms about how we go about acquiring justified belief or knowledge. So there'd be norms like, if you find evidence that a certain event has occurred, you should update your credence that that event has occurred, that sort of thing. So there's going to be, and that's not a moral claim. That's a claim about how you go about forming beliefs and reasoning. It'd be really weird to just not care about the degree to which evidence or considerations, you could say, counted in favor of holding a particular belief. There's like, evidence seemed to support some conclusions over others. You ought to comport your beliefs in accordance with that evidence in an appropriate way. That's roughly the idea. It's not a moral norm, it's an epistemic norm. So the idea here is, hey, if you want to give up moral realism, you're going to have to give up epistemic realism. Now, keep in mind, epistemic realism is not the view that like knowledge is possible. It's the view that it's epistemic normative realism. It's the view that there are stance-independent facts about what epistemic practices you ought to employ that are, you could say, epistemically good or bad, or that the analogy is to morality. And so these are prescriptive claims. These are not descriptive claims. You could, if you're naturalizing epistemology, maybe that would actually be different. But roughly the idea here is that this is not like facts about whether knowledge exists or not. It's facts about the normative practices one ought to employ with respect to going about forming beliefs. So the idea here would be, hey, if you want to reject moral realism, you'd have to reject epistemic realism, but epistemic realism is true, so you shouldn't reject moral realism either. That's roughly the idea. And there's a couple ways you could respond to this. One way would be to try to reject the parity premise, that there is a parity in moral realism and epistemic realism such that they stand or fall together. So it's either, in other words, what the argument tries to show is you've got to reject both or you got to accept both. And typically the hope is that since you already accept one, you'll accept the other. But one thing you could do is try to break the parity between the two and say, okay, it's not the case that if I reject moral realism, I have to reject epistemic realism. I could reject moral realism without having to reject epistemic realism. And that's a route some anti-realists about morality might want to go. That's the route I go. I think it's the better route to go. I don't think there's any good reason to be an epistemic realist either. So I endorse global normative anti-realism. I think that there are no stance-independent normative facts in any domain. And I think that's the best position. And it's probably a very unpopular position in academic philosophy. So much for academic philosophy that most of them are wrong about this.
And we'll discuss that just a little bit, and then we can move into to your theory.
Yeah, no, I like that. One of the things that I often use are thought experiments. Sometimes when you're trying to make the case for something, in this case, moral realism, you can put forth the alternative, right? If moral realism was false or if subjectivism was true, and show the absurdities that would result, reductio ad absurdum, you could call them, and just to show how absurd it would be if moral realism was false.
Right. I would be curious to know what the absurdities are.
So I think those are some helpful ways to make a case for objective moral truth as well. But again, I think this is the more difficult premise, right? Because if somebody is just going to dig in their heels and just claim that they don't believe in objective moral truth, I think
it's interesting, the framing, digging in your heels. Why is it digging in my heels? So, imagine a similar framing. Like, I don't think moral realism is remotely plausible, right? Like, I think there's almost no chance that it could be true. I'm not even sure it's some forms of moral realism. I don't even think are propositions. So, like, I don't think they could be true in principle. And so I literally would say, it's not that I think that the probability of them is low. It's that they're not even candidates for having a low probability in the first place. They're like literally nonsense. So when you have that view, and then you compare it to something like Bigfoot, would you tell a Bigfoot skeptic that, oh, well, you could just dig in your heels and refuse to believe? Notice the rhetoric behind the framing. Imagine I brought someone on here that thinks the earth is round. And, I said, well, you could dig in your heels and refuse to believe otherwise. And it would clearly indicate that I'm taking some view to be so plausible that it has some sort of priority. And okay, it's not just that a person that disagrees with you about that position disagrees with you about the position. They can, and in fact I do with respect to realism, also disagree about the priority that your position supposedly enjoys, that you're presuming it enjoys. I don't think there's any presumption in favor of realism, or hardly any. I mean, the one presumption it has going for it, I think, is that the majority of analytic philosophers that responded to the 2020 philpapers survey endorsed moral realism. Big whoop. That's not that big of a deal. That's one thing in favor of it. It's not much. So I don't think that there's that much of a presumption in favor of realism in the first place. And what you'll notice, though, in philosophical disputes is that philosophy, ideally, people should be more neutral about the way that they frame things. But philosophers often approach issues with this. There's like, when you start a particular dispute about an issue, there is a default position. And so there's basically philosophers approach philosophical issues as though there's always a home team. And you can root for the other team if you want, but it comes at a cost. You have to pay a cost. And the idea here, free will. You want to reject free will, you have to pay a cost. Morality, you want to reject moral realism, you have to pay a cost. External world, you want to reject the external world, you have to pay a cost. Scientific realism, you want to reject that the what's posited by our scientific theories is real, you have to pay a cost. It's all these costs you supposedly have to give up if you want to reject it. Is atheism paying a cost in rejecting God? Maybe. Like, let's suppose that it's not just that God exists, but that the arguments for God's existence are really good. And if you want to be an atheist, you have to bite a lot of bullets. You have to give up a lot of like explanatory power or whatever it is that would make theism like a better explanation for some set of observations. If that's the case, then a theist could say, look, theism is true. And if you want to reject it, you got to dig in your heels. There's certain like really plausible premises you're going to have to reject. But do you think atheists go, I agree with that? I agree. So I'm the skeptic about God's existence. I don't believe in God, but I recognize I'm digging in my heels. I'm being super skeptical. I have these maybe standards that are possibly unreasonably high. I think a lot of them will go, no, I don't think you made a realistic, you didn't make a plausible case in the first place. So a lot of atheists would respond by, and I'm not even saying, although I do think they're correct, I'm not saying they're correct to do this. They might say, I don't think there's or at least I agree with him. I don't know that some of this is correct. Some of it is just going to be descriptive. Like, as a matter of descriptive fact, I just have a low prior in the existence of God. I don't know that I'm justified. I don't even think that's the sort of thing you could be justified. It just doesn't seem to me like a God exists. If it did seem to me like a God exists, my prior would be higher. But the point just here is just that look at that debate, and it's not that weird to think about atheists just going, look, it's not that I'm being super stubborn and skeptical and resistant and digging in my heels. I don't think you've made a good case in the first place. So I reject your position, and I reject that there's some. So Anti-realists about morality historically just haven't done this. They've just conceded the ground. So it's like they start the battle and the realists control the territory, and it's the anti-realist job to win the territory. And I just don't buy that frame. I don't buy it. And I'm not the only one. There's this paper by Neil Sinclair that argues against the presumption in favor of realism. So one paper I've seen on it. So there's one paper. But, you know, this has got to change. So realists, I think, have done a lot to frame the dialectic in a way that there's a presumption in favor of their view. And I think that framing is pure rhetoric. It's pure rhetoric. It hasn't been justified. I'm not granting it. And I think that anti-realists have been retreating on rhetorical grounds to realists. And this is why I have become so interested in that facet of these debates, because there's so many philosophers, the realists and the anti-realists, that will get into the weeds. They hash it out in like with the, you know, they'll argue about this argument, the companions and guilt, and this technical response and that technical response. And I see all that technical work, and a lot of that technical work, once you look into it, where someone lands on this or that premise in an argument ultimately turns on what they take to be their intuitions about it, or what they take the entailments of it to be. So realists will say, if you're an anti-realist, then you can't say that there's anything wrong with hurting people for fun. Yeah, I can. Watch. It's wrong to hurt people for fun. Look, I could say it. Now, if you think I'm making a contradiction, you're going to have to tell me what the contradiction is. And that's going to involve telling me what I mean by that. Now, and I think that's going to be a hell of a lot of a problem, because I can tell you what I mean. I got a better sense of it than what realists do. And there's no contradiction. I'm not making any mistakes there. And if they want to present a different view of language where what I mean isn't what I intend to mean, great. Then let's shift over to a discussion about language. But anti-realists, they need to do a better job of this. They are allowing realists to frame anti-realists as psychopaths, as evil, as monsters, as living out performative contradictions. I think that that's implied in the remarks that we saw in this video, that like you can't really consistently live like an anti-realist. Yes, you can. Why aren't anti-realists arguing against that? Why aren't anti-realists pointing out the thing I point out, normative entanglement? For those of you that haven't seen this before, some of you might have already heard this. I'll try to be quick with it. So imagine this dialogue. So the realist asks the anti-realist, hey, do you think it's objectively wrong to hurt people just for fun? Now, if you're an anti-realist and you're in front of a big audience, what are you going to do? Is just say no. So if you say yes, they'll go, aha, so you agree with me. You're a realist now. I win, haha. So yes isn't an option. What about no? Hey, do you think it's objectively wrong to hurt people just for fun? No. What's your audience going to think? They're going to think you're an asshole. They're not going to like you. You sound like a monster. And the realists might even exploit that. They go, wow, look at that. Look at that. You don't even think there's anything wrong with just hurting people for fun. This is what anti-realism leaves you with. It makes you a monster. Don't even care if people get hurt. So realists do this kind of stuff all the time, including professional philosophers. Now, if you're an anti-realist, you could think, well, I don't think it's objectively wrong, but I do think it's morally wrong. I oppose it. I'm against it. I think it's repugnant and bad. The anti-realists could even have the exact same emotional reaction, behavioral response. They could have a behaviorally indistinguishable profile from the realist. Other than that, they say no to that question instead of yes. That's it. That's the only difference, is they disagree on this abstract point about the metaphysics of morality, but practically speaking, their attitudes, their behavior, their disposition, what they care about, all of that is identical to the realist. That is completely consistent with being a moral anti-realist. And yet, realists will imply it's not. They will imply it quite strongly. Sometimes they'll assert it explicitly, that if you're an anti-realist, somehow you're bereft of the ability to care about other people or to do good things, because there is no good. Okay, well, there's stuff you care about. So if by good you mean stuff you care about, then sure, there is stuff you care about. So yeah, and you could care about people not getting hurt just for fun. You can care about that. I do care about that. I don't want people to get hurt just for fun, and I'm going to act accordingly. I don't need there to be an objective fact. And this is often a question I ask realists. What if you became an anti-realist? What if you just were like, oh my God, I guess all the arguments are no good. And you lose your intuitions. And it's just, yeah, I guess you're convinced anti-realism is true. Would you stop caring about people? Would you treat people any worse? So let's say there's a certain way you treat people and you think it's the right way to treat people. It's a good way to treat people. And then you come to believe rightness and goodness, they're not objective. They're subjective. And okay, so do you treat people differently? Do you treat them worse now? Hey, nothing matters, right? Because the only sense in which things could matter, if you're a realist, is it mattering objectively. So if they don't objectively matter, they don't matter at all. Okay, so you don't care about your family anymore? Just don't care? You just say, yeah, sorry, mom and dad. Sorry, yeah, there's no objective fact, so I don't care about you anymore. So if you get sick and die, I'm not even going to go to the funeral. I don't care. I'll play video games. No, I won't play video games because I don't even care about my own, about myself. I don't care about my own well-being. I'm not even going to do that. I'll just lay around. So you just lay around and don't do anything because there's no objective facts. Nothing matters. It's ridiculous. Why would you think that? And the irony of it is that realists will say, really? Well, if a realist conditionally wouldn't care about anything or do anything or treat people well or not commit crimes or whatever, if realism wasn't true, then it looks to me like they're engaged in a performative contradiction or a potential performative contradiction, which is that if they became anti-realists, they'd do all that stuff anyway. They'd still be good. They wouldn't commit the crimes. They'd still care about their family. So it looks like everything would remain functionally intact. All of the attitudes, the feelings, the expressions, the judgments, how they treat people, all of that is completely preserved if they become an anti-realist. So what difference does realism make? I think the answer is absolutely none. It doesn't make any practical difference. None. Doesn't do anything. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Doesn't do anything. So what does it mean to act like a realist? Nothing. Nothing. It doesn't make any difference. It's a bizarre thing that realists think being an anti-realist carries all these horrible practical implications. I'm not just claiming that anti-realism is by far the best position. I'm not just claiming there's no arguments, the good arguments for moral realism. I'm claiming that moral realism has nothing going for it. It's not the case that most people are moral realists. It's not the case that the arguments favor moral realism. It's not the case that being an anti-realist carries horrible implications. Anti-realists win on every single account, all of them. It's just a clean sweep. I'm not sure there's much else to say about this video.
It can be difficult to then get to premise two. But no, I think that there are good solid reasons to believe in moral realism. It's just a more difficult premise to argue for, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose I can also just remind the audience really quickly that I have had Eric Wielenberg on the show.
Okay, so we are done with that video. I don't think that there was more for me to cover from that. I am going to take a quick break, and I'm fired up, so I'm going to keep going with another video. So everybody, I'm sorry for the lull in the conversation, but I got to take a break, and I will be right back in a couple minutes. All right, everyone, I am back. Let me go through comments, and then we will move to the next video. All right, let's see. I think I got to go up a ways. I think people have been asking questions for a while. All right. Oh, wow. Yeah, they've been going for a while now. Okay, I'll start with this one. So Inyinzi asks, Lance, I wonder why you are so passionate about / interested in arguing against moral realism when, as far as I understand, you agree that, quote, ordinary people, so this is ordinary people, it's like non-philosophers, don't really have metaethical commitments. Well, I don't see the two as that related. So yeah, I don't think ordinary people are moral realists or anti-realists. I think they're neither. But, you know, I don't think ordinary people have views about quantum mechanics. That could still be an interesting topic. So maybe I don't understand what the connection would be. You know, I really care about, well, maybe you could elaborate, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I just like the topic. Part of what I think is motivating me, and here, actually, let me pause to say something about this. You know, people get into certain things, they like certain things, and you could ask them why, and I could give an explanation for why. But you know, I'm theorizing about myself as much as you might theorize about why someone else did a thing that you're like, why did they do that? And you could say, maybe they did it because of this reason. I got to do that about myself. I don't think that we always know the reasons why we do the things we do. So how did I get into metaethics? I'm not sure. I could tell the story. I don't know how much the story is true. But part of what interested me about morality and how I got into it, if I recall, and again, this is a reconstructed narrative from our flawed reconstructed memory with motivated reasoning and all the problems, all the caveats, put all the caveats in there. I recall encountering the trolley problem and just not having the reaction people had to the trolley scenario and the footbridge scenario, the violinist scenario. I seem to have these utilitarian intuitions. Now, it wasn't like I was just callous and cold and I'm like, yeah, in the footbridge scenario, you should push the person off the footbridge. It was more like, oh, I wouldn't want to do that. But if it really was a scenario where you could know all of the facts about the scenario, it's an isolated one-off event, it's not going to lead to an epidemic of people pushing people off the bridges, it might be the best thing to do. I don't know if I could do it. I probably couldn't. I'm confident I couldn't. I think I would struggle to pull the switch in the switch case. So that would be a problem for me, that there would be the question of what I would do. But the question of what I should do, yeah, I think you should maximize utility. So I had these utilitarian inclinations, and this also applied to the violinist case and some other cases. You could look these up. I'm not going to get into these. You're probably familiar with some of them. So basically, I had moral intuitions that were out of accord with what people said the intuitive reaction to these things were. And I found that interesting. And I also got a lot of frustrating pushback. And that pushback involved people, like some people questioning whether I really had those intuitions, or implying there's something wrong with you or bad about you if you don't share the mainstream intuitions. And at the time, I don't know exactly what I thought, but now I think that this reliance on intuitions is a method of social reinforcement for majority views and for status quo retention in philosophy. Basically, I think that people whose views are ascendant, people whose views are the dominant position, use appeals to, hey, it's intuitive, to bully people that don't have those intuitions into shutting up or reporting that they have the intuitions too. And I'm serious about that. I actually think philosophers probably do this and don't realize they're doing it. I think there's a degree of social coercion and bandwagoning that's going on. And I think they don't realize it. And I think it's probably a major biasing influence in the field. So, you know, just imagine that it works this way, right? Hypothetically, whoever the philosophy professors are, they all have the same intuitions for whatever reason. They have certain intuitions, and they give people a hard time if those people don't report having the same intuition. So students come in the class, there's a dispute about a philosophical issue. There's option A, option B. All philosophers say that their intuitive response is option A. And let's say in a normal society, there's like a normal distribution of positions on A and B. Some people are strong A proponents, some people are strong B proponents, a lot of people around the middle. So because all the professors endorse A, when students come in, they're like, A is the intuitive position. And so the A students are like, yeah, we got the right position. And the B students are like, I don't think so. And then the other students are like, well, the professor agrees with us, so you're just wrong here. You know, so shut up. You got the wrong intuitions. Now, what's going to happen to the students? Do you think that the students with the A inclinations and the B inclinations are equally likely to become professional philosophers themselves? I don't think so. I think that students with strong A intuitions are most likely to become professional philosophers, followed by students with weak A intuitions. And then maybe followed by students with strong B intuitions. Why? Because those people might say, no, A is totally wrong. I'm going to fight against it. And maybe it's the people with the weak B intuitions that are least likely to pursue in the field because they're like, well, I don't have those intuitions, but I also don't care that much. So you see two patterns here. One, philosophy may attract people that tend to have polarizing or extra strong intuitions, the strong sense that, like, when you're just sitting in the armchair, oh, this is the right answer to the footbridge case. You totally shouldn't push, or you totally should push. Kind of people that are ambivalent may not pursue philosophy because they're not intuition-y. So I think philosophers are probably self-selecting for people that are intuition-y, that are more inclined to report intuitions on these sorts of things. So that's one factor. So the whole middle of the normal distribution, assuming it's a normal distribution, gets cut out. Those are the least likely to be interested. Notice something about that. If you're looking at a normal distribution, those people are the most typical. And so philosophy might actually be self-selecting for the most psychologically idiosyncratic people of all. And I suspect that I think it is. I'm serious about that. I actually think that might be true. I'm not saying it is true. I'm saying that's a testable hypothesis. It's one problem. The other problem is that when you create that situation, you're self-selecting for people that share this mainstream view. And what's the effect of that? It's self-reinforcing. So if all the A philosophers prefer the A intuitions and they bully people that don't have them, what you'll get is mostly people with strong A intuitions, a large number of people with weak A intuitions, and then a small contingent of people with B intuitions fighting against the majority. What is the anti-realist landscape? What does the metaethical landscape look like? Looks like that. That's what it looks like. It looks like a bunch of people that are like, you get this small number of people that are aggressively convinced of realism, a whole bunch of people that are like, yeah, I'm a realist, whatever. And then you get this group of anti-realists like me, who are the smaller group. It looks just like that. Now, am I saying that means my theory is correct? No. What I am saying is that I think sociological and psychological factors influence who becomes philosophers and how they do philosophy. And I think that raises serious questions about appealing to the proportion of philosophers that endorse a view as evidence that the view is true. Think about the scenario I described. So if all the A philosophers were put there by chance, or they were put there by, I don't know, a mad tyrant that happened for like randomly flip a coin, it doesn't matter. The point is, as long as they weren't put there because the arguments and reasons for the position were good, and that's why, if they were put there by randomness or chance or whatever, as long as they started out in that position, as long as they ended up with that preponderance in their favor, that can create this self-reinforcing cycle that favors one position over another for reasons unrelated to the merits of the position. That is the problem. And philosophers that keep appealing, and non-philosophers too, to these proportions, it's like they think that, it's like we randomly selected people from the population. They all started out at exactly neutral on whether a position like realism or anti-realism is true. Then, so like here, it's a ridiculous view, right? So we randomly select people out of the population. We are not selecting people that are more inclined towards realism or anti-realism. It's exactly equal. We have them start studying philosophy. They read all the arguments for and against realism and anti-realism, and then they favor one or the other. And oh, look, most of them ended up favoring realism, so that's good evidence of realism. That actually would be pretty good evidence of realism. Like, that'd be a lot better than what we've got. But the bottom line is, we don't even know what we've got. How many people started out as realists or anti-realists? I don't know. Maybe they started out as neither. What were their initial inclinations in their first intro to philosophy class? I don't know. Nobody knows. So like, we're dealing with a situation where the causal arrows for what's causing what and why people think what, we don't have a clue. We don't have a damn clue. But the raw proportion that favor a view is not good evidence. Think about it this way. Imagine if, because, realists, you have realists say almost everybody's a realist. Almost everyone thinks like a realist. Okay, let's run with that. Let's say it's 99%. Okay, so the base rate of realism in the general population is 99%. And let's just simplify this argument and ignore selection effects. So philosophers, they're just drawn from that base rate of the population. It's just, they're 99% of them start out as realists. And then we see, oh, wow, 62% of them are realists. So, give me 1 second, actually. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. So 62% are realists. It looks like the rate of realism went down. That seems like a problem, doesn't it? So studying philosophy caused them to go from 99% to 62%. Why is that evidence that realism is true? It's evidence that people have a super strong bias in favor of realism that's partially corrected by studying philosophy. That's what it's evidence of. So we need to know the causal direction. We don't. So the majority endorsing a view just isn't good evidence of the view. Okay, let's look at more questions. All right, Roberto says, hey, Lance, would love to hear your thoughts on some papers elaborating on acquaintance-based realism. I'd need to hear more about what that is, like acquaintance-based. So I know that some people will appeal to this like Russellian conception of acquaintance. I have huge problems with that. It doesn't look intelligible to me. I don't know what they're talking about. And I'm not sure that they're talking about anything in particular. I'm not even sure that's an accurate characterization of Russell. I'm not a Russell scholar. I don't know. So I'd have to talk to them or read more about the view. Yeah, you could just email me. So sorry to read the rest of this. I can send you those to your email, right? Obviously not expecting an answer if you lack the time or interest. I have the interest. I don't know if I have the time. I always prefer for this sort of format to like talk to people. So if you want to come on here and talk, or you want to have a conversation privately about it, that's fine. I'm probably not going to sit down and read books and papers. I got too much other stuff to do. All right. Good discussion in here. Thanks everybody for talking to each other. Please do that. I love it. Just because I'm not commenting on all of your comments, I just don't have time for all that. So I address questions directed to me. Also, you could totally use the @ thing and like direct, like that makes it easier for me to see the questions. All right. Still going through looking for questions. Looks like people talking to each other. So Mystic Waters asked me this. Hey, Lance, you didn't get time to speak about pragmatism, about meaningful yesterday. Can you tell us your view? Yeah, so it's just something I'm going to have to do more work on this and read more and study more and do something more specific about this. But very roughly, part of my own approach to considering whether terms or concepts is meaningful has to do ultimately with their degree of integratedness with the rest of our terms and concepts. And ultimately, this has got to bottom out in some sort of practical difference or some sort of experiential or predictable difference in what the world is like. So if you have two conceptual schemes, and they both end up making predictions about the world that are indistinguishable from one another, I don't think it makes sense to talk about one of them being true and one of them being false. They're equally good. So for me, terms are meaningless when the truth of the term being true, as opposed to not true, would have no practical implications. That's my view, at least. Now, that is undoubtedly an extremely controversial view. I don't care. That's my view. But one thing I'll say about that is, even if someone doesn't like that view of meaningfulness, like a pragmatic view of meaningfulness, where terms or concepts are meaningful to the extent that the truth of the term as opposed to its falsehood would make some practical difference or would have some pragmatic implications, even if you reject that, I still think that certain terms or concepts, even on other conceptions of meaningfulness, that I still think some of the terms that philosophers use still would not be meaningful on a range of accounts of meaningfulness that are not pragmatic. So I think that it would still be a problem to account for what philosophers mean. Like, I don't think you have to be a pragmatist to say that "'twas brillig in the slithy toves" like that's nonsense. It's not meaningful. Basically intentional nonsense terms. Or if somebody said, if glorp then florp, glorp therefore florp, or something like that, and you say, what does glorp mean? And they say it's sui generis, and you just have to know. And if you have to ask, you'll never know. I think the rest of us would say, yeah, you're probably full of nonsense. That's just nonsense. So if your account can't cash that out as nonsense, you got a problem with your account. And I don't care if it's pragmatist or not. Oh, right. Someone is saying something about making a stream about cultural relativism. Do you mean like join the stream and talk to me, or make your own video? I don't know what you're suggesting there. Still looking for comments. Oh, this is, we could take a little break before we get back into the serious stuff. So Patrick with writer says, Lance, what's the update on your headphone situation? Did you find some nice ones? Yeah, so I have some over there. They're Sony, WXM, MX, I don't know what it is. but they're 1 or 2 generations back. Those are excellent. Those are the noise canceling ones. These ones right now, let me look up what these are. I don't remember exactly what they are. Give me a moment. I'll let you know what they are. But they're okay. I got like a cheaper set of headphones. They were on some like Black Friday sale. When I say cheap, I just mean low priced. I'm not knocking their quality. I'm very happy with them. I tend to like, you'll see that these headphones are pretty big. So I like big headphones. I don't like stuff that's like tight and squishing my head. And these are super comfortable. So that's the main thing for them. And the audio quality for the price is fantastic. So let's see. I'm looking up what exactly these headphones are. When did I buy these? I must have bought them a while ago. Here they are. I have, yeah, one. Oh, the screen messed up. Okay. I have one audio, Bluetooth over ear headphones. Yeah. So one audio is the ones that made them. So that's what I've got. And I'm happy with them. There's fancier headphones, but for the price, I don't know what I spent, $40 something. They're, for that price, these are great. Really long battery life, super comfortable. You can see they're really large, very adjustable, really flexible. These things turn all over the place. So they're doing the job. I don't remember what happened. I had some problem with headphones before, I think, maybe. I don't know. So this is an interesting remark. I don't comment on remarks a lot, but so Inyenzi says, realism might seem intuitive to some people because if I imagine the world absent myself and my judgments, it still seems to me as if the things that I think are wrong should still be wrong. So the thing about this is, well, one, it doesn't seem that way to me, but I wonder at our, can we simulate a universe where we're not in it and then we consider whether things would be wrong even if we weren't in it? I don't know exactly what that means. Like, even if I wasn't in the world, I wouldn't want people, like when I die, I don't want people to start just doing whatever they wanted. I want people to be nice to each other even after I'm dead. So I don't need to be in the world. So from what perspective am I judging this world? From my perspective or from no particular perspective? You know, I think I might have given this comparison in a stream recently, but a lot of philosophers will act like we can occupy a perspective from nowhere, from no particular perspective, and then evaluate things. And I don't think we could do that because I don't think it makes any sense. So, you know, again, I don't know if I gave this, but I'll just give it anyway. You know, imagine you're in a room, and the room, there's varying degrees of lighting, and there's like obstacles in the room or whatever. But in the middle of the room, on a pedestal, there's a basketball. And you're on one side of the room and you're looking at it. Someone else is on another side of the room and they're looking at the basketball. Well, whatever angle you're looking at it from, maybe you can only see half of it because it's occluded. Maybe you see it in good lighting conditions and they see it at a bad angle and they don't see it in good lighting conditions. Whatever it is, you know, you may or may not see the basketball, but let's assume you and another person can see at least part of it. Okay, well, there's something you would be seeing and you could give a description of it. From your perspective, the basketball seems like something. Now, what would the basketball look like from no particular perspective? So you're not occupying any vantage point in the room. You're not above the basketball. You're not below the basketball. You're not to the left. You're not to the right. You're not in the dark. You're not in the light. You're nowhere. What would it look like there? I don't think the question makes sense. I think it's an ill-formed question. Basketballs only look like something from a perspective. They look like it to a perspective. It's just the sort of thing where it doesn't make sense to ask what it would be like. And I think it's the same thing for any kind of evaluative consideration, any kind of consideration about what you should or shouldn't do or what would be good or bad. I don't know what it would mean in principle, and this is because I don't think it means anything, for something to be good or bad or right or wrong from no particular standpoint or point of view. For me, these issues are conceptually perspectival, or you could say indexed or relativistic. For me, like if I was going to appeal and use the a priori method, I'd just say, yeah, it's self-evident that morality is subjective or something like that. I might say something like that. And because it does seem to me that way. And I can't think of a time when it didn't seem to me that way. And philosophers can say, oh, well, you must have once been a realist. And the only reason you're an anti-realist now is because you became convinced of naturalism and you're caught in the grip of a theory. Bullshit. None of that is true. None of that is true. I never felt that way. I remember sitting around with my friends when I was 19 or 20. I recall that because I remember talking about error theory, being absolutely convinced of anti-realism at the time. It's been almost 20 years. I don't remember a time before that when I thought otherwise. So seems that way to me, seems obvious to me. Obvious. But you you don't see me leveraging that so much. And he's like, hey, well, realism seems obviously false to me, therefore it's false, therefore there's a presumption in favor of my view. Well, it regulates my beliefs. I'm not going to endorse a view that doesn't, like, it seems true to me, and I haven't been given good reasons to change my mind. But I don't think it's a reason for realists to be anti-realists, that it seems obvious to me that realism is false. Why should they care? What do they care about that? They shouldn't care about it. Who cares? Who cares what I think? So I don't understand why philosophers put so much stock in what they think about these sorts of things. Anyway, let's keep going. Oh, right. Wow, lots of comments. And yeah, do feel free to direct questions at me and I'll try to get to them. There's another one from Inyinzi. Let's say dependent. Do moral realist philosophers give a detailed account of how those moral facts exist? Some do, yeah. Mm-hmm. Like, are they in a Platonic realm? Some are Platonists. Do they just float somewhere? No, they don't float somewhere. It's really going to depend on the account. It's going to depend on naturalist and non-naturalist accounts are going to have different views. Some think that realism can be characterized in a way that doesn't have strong metaphysical commitments. So you're going to get like Scanlon and Parfit and some other people, Sepielli maybe. There's different views about that. Then you're going to get ones that have these more robust metaphysics, and they're going to be Platonistic. You're going to get some that they're teleological or they're tied to some sort of theistic account. Those are going to have a different metaphysical framework. And then you're going to get the naturalist accounts. And then you're going to get analytic and synthetic ones. I'm not going to go through a whole like canvassing all the different views, but there's a variety of metaphysical views that are consistent with and characterize the different types of realism that are out there. They do give long, detailed explanations of what they mean by this stuff and how it could be and how we could know about it. So realists do not just sit on their bums and just say, yeah, we just know the moral facts. If they think that there's not a bunch of metaphysics to go on about, they'll argue for why. If they think there is, they'll argue for their particular metaphysical position. If you then would worry, well, okay, well, if they're not natural facts, then they'll give an account of their moral epistemology. So realists are doing their work. They're doing their homework to develop their positions. My main concern is the way that they talk about anti-realism. It's not so much that they're not doing work in favor of their own positions. They are. All right. I'm not going to read that question. This is a good question. So Truth Over Tea says, what's your opinion on Aristotelian or Christian virtue ethics? Don't know that much about it. I mean, so like I've encountered virtue ethics and Aristotelian views about ethics, but it's not something I've studied a whole lot. And especially the metaethical elements of like teleological accounts, I just don't really deal with those a whole lot. Most of the contemporary realist accounts that I deal with are non-naturalist secular realists, and then you're going to get a handful of naturalists. But the theistic accounts, I just haven't had as much experience with. They're actually not very common in the analytic metaethics literature. It's mostly secular people, atheists. Now, I say secular instead of atheist for a reason. Even non-naturalist realists in the field that are working in analytic metaethics will rarely invoke God as an explanation for their accounts. So Terence Cuneo and some others are, to my knowledge, are Christians, but the accounts would work whether you're a Christian or not. Like they seem consistent with Christianity, but you don't have to be a Christian to accept like a Companions of Guild argument or something like that. Okay, so that gets us caught up. Let's get to another video. I hope I have these timestamped. Yes, so I'm not going to get to the longer ones. I'll do a fun one first. And then I'll just give you a sense of what I'm going to be discussing. There's a discussion with T-Jump. In fact, I have two. One with Eric Schwitzgable and one with Destiny that I'll be going through. And those are going to probably be longer videos, so I'm not going to do those today. And this one we're done with. Okay. And I'm going to do the short video. I haven't watched this. I don't know what's in it. So hopefully nothing too silly or embarrassing or irrelevant. But let's see. Oh, wait. I actually have to share it first. I was about to play it. Is meaning possible without God? I don't know what the volume looks like for this.
Bill, I get this question a lot. Well, evolution just gives us morality.
Sounds okay to me.
Response or two to that.
I'm going to run with it. Adjust your volume if you don't like it. All right. And again, I haven't listened to this one. I don't know what's in this one. Usually I listen to these first, or at least listen to part of them, just to make sure it's not totally irrelevant or that they say things that I wouldn't want to show on here. I don't like when people give like really, well, it doesn't matter.
Bill, I get this question a lot. Well, evolution just gives us morality. Can you give us a response or two to that?
Yeah, that's an argument that I use.
For the record, I don't think evolution just gives us morality. I don't think that's way too simplistic a claim, but I do hear that myself. So even I don't think that. That doesn't mean I'm anti-evolution. It just means that I think certain things, well, I mean, I'm taking this to mean evolution in the biological sense. Lots of things humans do are not a direct product of natural selection or biological evolution, like playing chess. We're not adapted to play chess. And my own view is that morality is a cultural construction. It's not like part of our biology.
In support of the first premise. If God does not exist as a transcendent standard for good and evil, then moral values are just the spin-offs of biological and sociocultural evolution. So they're
that's great. I like that.
Sociocultural,
biological and sociocultural evolution. There you go. Yeah. So I agree with that. So I tend to endorse gene culture co-evolutionary views. I do think biology and natural selection are definitely involved in human morality, but what I don't think is that we evolved a distinctive capacity for moral cognition that's shared, like it's a pan-cultural feature of like all human populations. I don't think there's that. I do think that people have a disposition for certain types of emotional reactions, certain sort of evolved predispositions to respond to certain things in certain sorts of ways, and that those things have led to and filtered into the construction of morality as a normative domain. But I think that notion of there being this distinct moral domain, that is the cultural part that's sitting on top of all this. I do think people have, like, for instance, I think that if you looked at a bunch of different societies, regardless of culture and language, people are typically going to not like when people are radically unfair. They're not going to like people that are uncooperative. They're not going to like people that do certain sorts of things. So you're going to find these sort of I don't know about culturally universal, but a strong predisposition for developing certain sorts of norms and biological basis. But I think that this is the distinctive ways that we think about these issues in weird populations, there's a big cultural element there. And that if you look at other populations, you'll see that there are significant cultural differences across different societies about how they think about normative issues. But every society is going to have some type of normative issues. I just don't think that we should construe everything in terms of the specific way of thinking about normativity and morality that's characteristic of analytic philosophers. I don't think that the way they think is the way everybody else thinks.
Evolution. So they're absolutely right what these students say. If atheism is true, it seems to me that's all moral values are. And if you were to
wait, evolution, atheism, these are not the same thing.
Rewind the film of human evolution and shoot the film over again, a very different kind of creature, very different set of moral values might have evolved. And so who are we to say that our values are right and theirs are wrong? There's no basis for it.
You know, it's interesting, Bill, and I know you have that little video on the absurdity of life without God. In this whole coronavirus situation,
this is only like 2 minutes, by the way.
There is nobody on the atheist side or the Christian side saying, you know what, it's just survival of the fittest. Let's just let the virus take out the unfit people, and the fittest will survive.
Okay, this is getting a bit silly.
So even atheists, someone like Richard Dawkins, who says that there is no evil, there is no good, we just dance to our DNA. Even he admits that a Darwinian type morality is something we ought not live by. Where is he getting a standard by which to say that, Bill?
That's exactly right. I mean, Dawkins.
What are your only options, like survival of the fittest or God? What is going on here?
Is an undying moralist. He gives lip service to relativism and moral nihilism, but he can't live that way.
Oh God, this again. You can't live that way. Yes, you can live as an anti-realist. Yes, you can. What can you not do as an anti-realist? What can you not do? Say that there's objective moral facts. You could do that if you wanted to. You can't sincerely say that there's objective moral facts. That's it. That's all you can't do. There's no other implications.
And so the God delusion is filled with moral judgments for which there's no basis. And in fact, I've argued, as you probably know, Frank, that it's really impossible to live consistently and happily within an atheistic framework. Nobody can live consistently and happily as though his life is meaningless.
That is painful to listen to. I'm sorry. I mean, some people think William Lane Craig is this great philosopher, and it's just absolute rubbish. Just absolute rubbish. Embarrassing. That was painful to listen to. It's just embarrassing nonsense. It's just embarrassing nonsense. Yeah, that was upsetting to listen to. I apologize, everybody, for having put you through that. I'm sorry. Let's see. Did we get any comments on that one? That was rough. We need to wash that down with a different video. Yeah, Sapir says, isn't it overly simplistic to say evolution is survival of the fittest, natural selection? Yeah, so there's other mechanisms of change. So, if we're just talking about biological evolution, that would be change in the frequency of alleles in a population over time. But, there's also cultural evolution for humans on top of that. And changes in our culture can change the selective pressures from a biological perspective. So if your culture changes, that can change selective pressures. And then the biology is responsive to that. Changes in the biology can then in turn influence what changes in culture. And so the two can dynamically interact. And so humans have this cultural coevolutionary thing going on that makes us a rather interesting type of organism. But it's not natural selection isn't the only thing. There's genetic drift. There's other sorts of stuff going on besides that. But natural selection is still the primary driver of changes in organisms, at least biologically. So natural selection is still a big player here. People will say, there's 17 different mechanisms, and no, come on, natural selection is the big one. So survival of the fittest is just this especially ruthless rhetorical way of framing natural selection. Natural selection is just about if you make more copies of your genes, then there's more copies of your genes. And hey, genes code for proteins, and the proteins lead to there being different phenotypes. The phenotypes influence how good the DNA is at making copies of itself. That's what's going on. So really, it's largely about, hey, are you good at reproducing? Are you good at helping kin that share your genes? That survival of the fittest, people will say nature, red in tooth and claw, as if the whole thing is this like ruthless survival. Organisms are not, like natural selection isn't only a means to an end, and the end is reproduction. It's reproduction of the fittest is what it should be, not survival. So it's just a rhetorical way of making evolution look especially ruthless and callous and cold, which I'm not saying it isn't callous and indifferent. It is, but it's callous and indifferent towards reproduction, not towards survival. All right. And Yinzi says, do you get passionate about normative ethical debates as passionate about normative meta-ethical debates? Sorry, let me start this over. Maybe I'm running out of steam here. So Yinzi asks, Lance Independent, do you get as passionate about normative ethical debates as meta-ethical debates? How do you reconcile your general pragmatism with caring about meta-ethics so much? Big fan, by the way. Oh, thank you. So I do get passionate about normative issues. I just don't talk about them on the channel as much. So I've sort of stepped away. I keep saying this, and I'm going to keep saying it. I don't care if it sounds stupid, but I say I'm a retired utilitarian. So I was a utilitarian for a very long time. Now I don't endorse normative theories. I don't do a lot of normative theorizing. So, and I don't really get into debates about them. I still care about stuff. I just don't theorize about stuff. So it's really that, like, you could say I care about applied ethics and meta ethics, and then the stuff in the middle I don't care so much about. So if by normative ethical debates, you mean like the normative moral issues themselves in some applied context, then yeah, I do get passionate about those, but I don't actually debate them very much. If you mean normative theorizing directly, like deontology versus utilitarianism, for the most part, I've stopped caring about that. I'm not interested in those disputes. I think they're largely a waste of time. How do I reconcile my pragmatism with caring about metaethics? I don't know that there's anything to reconcile. I care about what I care about. I like what I like. I don't know that there's much more to it than that. Jamie Russell, Christian Middle Earth says, Lance Independent, the objections you gave were explained in the parts leading up to it. The objections I gave to what? To this last video or the previous video? Jamie Russell says, there is no foundation to complain that someone didn't save the drowning kid because they didn't want to be late for brunch. There's no foundation. What do you mean? I don't know that I don't need foundations to care about what I care about. So I'm going to complain if someone didn't save a drowning child because they wanted to get to lunch. I don't need a foundation for that. All right. Jan Miller says, somewhat related to earlier questions, how do you think metaethics bears on specific normative theories? Can the commitments of both be disentangled? I don't know exactly what you mean by disentangled. Some metaethical views are not like pure metaethical views because they appear to have normative implications. Agent relativism would be one example. It appears to have direct normative implications. If you're some type of nihilist that says there are no moral facts and that the only sense in which there could be moral facts is the objective sense and there aren't any, so nothing matters, that might have normative implications. So some anti-realist, sorry, I'm mentioning two anti-realist positions, but some realist view, not realism or anti-realism, some metaethical views seem to bake in or have as part of them stuff that would have normative entailments or implications. But I don't see those views as like purely metaethical. It's a theory it's a broader theory that has metaethical implications and normative implications, and they're bound up as part of the theory. So like it would, conditional on the theory being true, then there would be a certain entanglement between normative and metaethical considerations. But sort of meta-theoretically, stepping outside of that particular perspective, you're not obligated to think that it must be the case that metaethical and normative considerations are entangled with one another in some inextricable way. They may or they may not be, conditional on which metaethical theory is the correct metaethical theory. So I think it's possible that if a particular theory were correct, then the two would be like, you couldn't dissociate them from one another. Looking for questions. Sandel says, Lance Independent, what do you think about the name moral anti-realism misleading people thinking it means morals aren't real? Should it be named moral stance dependence instead? Yes, I did a blog post about this some time ago, maybe more than one. I've written about this, I've spoken about this, but yeah, so I don't like that moral anti-realism is, people will say, that means you think morality isn't real. It's right in the name. And I've had people argue with me about this. Well, they'll say, look, you can't think morality is real if you say you're an anti-realist. This is part of the name of the view. To think that it's like, if the label has some superficial, blunt interpretation, like some hyper literal interpretation, you must agree with the literal interpretation of the label, as if labels aren't amorphous and emerge in some conversational context that person might not be aware of. They just literally interpret the name of the view and then say, you must think that. It's so silly. But yeah, even professional philosophers will leverage the labels of the position to structure and frame the discussion in ways that makes anti-realism look stupid or evil or bad. And it's pretty annoying. And they shouldn't do that. And yeah, they should change the names. And somewhere I wrote, yeah, the most like technically accurate way of describing the views would be stance independentism and stance dependentism, or at least, sorry, it wouldn't be that. It would be stance independentism and non-stance independentism. Because you don't have to think that there are moral facts that are stance dependent. You could just think that you don't have to take any view on that. You could be agnostic. So if you're an anti-realist. So one view would hold there are stance independent facts. The other holds it's not the case that there are stance independent facts. That doesn't commit them to any positive view. So although you could have the atheist theist type of dispute and say, no, if you're an anti-realist, then you have to hold the positive view that there are no stance independent facts. Let's just run with that. That's fine. So then the views would be, there are stance independent facts, there are no stance independent facts. And so it'd be stance independentism and non-stance independentism. That's the most accurate way of framing it. Is anyone going to use those terms? No. If I propose any terms, is anybody going to take them up? Nope. Is there any way of framing it where people aren't going to complain about it? No. So we're kind of just stuck. Whatever. Okay, still looking for stuff. Patrick says, Lance, if someone had a normative moral system that happened to align with what you would do at all times, would you argue against them? Like, in what context? Probably not. What's there to argue about? I don't think so. I think no. I don't think I'd argue with them. If they wanted to argue about metaethics, I might do that. Oh, right. One more video? Yeah, let's do one more. Which one am I sharing? Response to criticism. Here it is. This should be on the right timestamp. We will see. Wow, look at that. Look at the comments on this. 2,001 comments, 76,000 views, and it was only 3 days ago. What on earth? What? Y'all got to help me out here. What is it? How many views does my current video have? Well, it's not going to tell me until the stream's over. There's like, what, 30, 40 of you here? How many of you? 33 people here. And then how many views I got? 33 watching. Let me refresh it to see if I got any likes so far. If you haven't liked the video, please consider liking the video. You could not like the video. If you hate the video, then I guess go with that. I got 13 likes so far. This one's got 5.5 thousand likes. We got to up our game here. It's not just me. It's you in the audience. Share these videos. Subscribe to this channel. Like this stuff. I'm just looking at this and I'm just like, geez, like what on 2,000? What? 2,000 comments. That's wild. Sorry, I didn't notice that before, and then I noticed it now, and it's remarkable. We got to work on that. And my drink's almost empty, and I took a couple breaks now, I think. 1 or 2, whatever. And I still didn't get another drink. Whatever. You don't care about that. Yeah, someone's saying you got to talk shit for engagement. Yeah, I'm not going to do that. Sensible videos rarely blow up. At least you're implying I'm sensible. That's nice. Okay, and then people are talking about the sexiness of the views. So Sandal says, I kind of think moral anti-realism is more sexy name than moral stance dependence, but I think nihilism is even more sexy. Nihilism, it's not sexy. Someone is asking me what I am drinking. This is peach tea. It's green tea with peach flavor. Okay, so we got this video up here. Let's play it. Highlight that. Don't know how we are in volume.
Now we get into B tier. So
I'm jumping forward in this video because there's a bunch of other arguments. I think they're arguments for God. Yeah. So it's a tier list. They're ranking arguments for God. If you haven't seen my video with Kane B, where we rank arguments for moral realism, go check it out because we do the same thing. We don't have something as cool as this graphical display. We should have done that, and we ended up being lame. But do check it out. It's on Kane B's channel and my channel. You could go to either one. Kane B gets way more views than me because he has like, what, 70,000 subscribers or something, and I have like 1,000. So check it out on my channel. No, but go to both channels, actually. Go to both. Okay. So so I'm just jumping ahead to where they're getting to the moral argument, and notice where it lands. It lands in B tier. That's pretty good. So far, it looks like the highest one on the list. So like that's troublesome. It shouldn't be this high. So let's see what they have to say. I think I started to listen to this and then I was like, ooh, I'm going to cover this. And then I stopped. So I don't know how much of this that I've already seen. I already forgot. Okay.
Moral argument I put in B tier. I think the moral argument is a pretty good argument. I think it's a terrible argument. Atheist philosophers would agree that morality is not objective if God does not exist. And
wait, what? Most philosophers would agree. Let's hear that again.
It's a pretty good argument. I think most atheist philosophers would agree that morality is not objective if God does not exist.
Now that's a troubling remark. Let's hear that a third time. Sorry, I just really want to make sure I get this argument down right.
the best arguments that religious people have are from personal experience, but I don't think bad for convincing anyone else.
Oh no, I went to the wrong place here.
Would agree that morality is not objective if God does not exist.
Yeah, so most philosophers would agree that morality is not objective if God does not exist. Now, there's a difference between the natural language implication of saying moral realism isn't going to be true if you don't have God. I think most philosophers are atheists, and most philosophers are moral realists. And if you exclude all the theists, the remaining philosophers, the atheist philosophers, it's still the case that most of them are moral realists. So what most of them are not going to think is that you can't have realism without God. They are not going to think that. So if that's what is being implied here, that's not true. However, if you look at the structure of a standard argument for moral realism, and it has this modus ponens structure, it's going to be something like this. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. You could always reconstrue it as a modus tollens if you want to, or something like that. But if you're looking at a modus ponens argument, you're going to have this structure, right? If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Here's the funny thing about that. If I'm giving you the argument, if I'm giving you an argument where I've got that claim where it's looking like I'm saying you got to have God to have objective morality, and then the second premise is you have objective morality, therefore you've got God. If you're looking at that, and typically it's structured with negations and like William Lane Craig's version of it. Here's the funny thing about a modus ponens. So you've got really, I guess you could say, four options here, right? So you could agree with both premises, you could reject both premises, you can accept the first premise and reject the second, or you could reject the first premise. Wait, I lost track of what I said. Your options are both premises are true, both premises are false, the first one is true, the second's false, or the first one's false, so the second one's true. Those are your four options. Now, if you're an atheist and you don't want to accept a moral argument for the existence of God, of course you're not going to accept both premises, because the entailment is God exists. So you're not going to accept both, which means you got to reject at least one. So what happens if you reject both of them? You actually get a contradiction. You cannot. It's not logically consistent to reject both premises of a modus ponens. You can't do it. Here's why. So you have that first statement, if P, then Q, and then the second one, P, so then the conclusion, Q, right? Now, if you do out a truth table where you say, okay, like what are all the possible ways of assigning truth values to if P, then Q, you have true, 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 false, false, true, false, false. Now, the way that conditionals work is they're always going to be true unless the P is true and the Q is false. So there's only one way that they end up being false, which is TF. So your options are TT, TF, FT, and FF. If you've got true, true, then it's true. If you've got true, false, it's false. If you've got false, true, it's true. If you've got false, false, it's still true. So conditionals are funny. That's how they work. That's how a material conditional works. Too bad. Now, plug in the values you have to plug in the values for both of the premises at the same time and see what you get. So if you accept if you accept that second premise, P, okay, well now you go plug that into the other one. Your options, it's true in other words. So P is true. So you've got if P, then Q. Okay, well you've got TT and TF. If it's TT, it's true. If it's TF, it's false. So if you think that second premise is true, then you're stuck with saying basically that if you think the second premise is true, you're going to have to think that the first premise is either also true, in which case you accept the whole argument because it's true, or you have to accept that the first premise is false. So you got false and then true. So that's one option, that the first premise is false and the second premise is true. Just deny moral realism is true. But then look what happens. Now you have to plug in that F, because if the second premise is just P, then the second premise is false. But that means the only way that that's true is if P is false, because that's your only option. It's T or it's F, because it's just P. So if P is F, it's false. Okay, now you plug that back in the first one. You have an F then. It doesn't matter what happens, because remember, the conditional is only going to turn out to be false if you have a T and then an F. But if you have an F and a T or an F and an F, it's going to be true. Well, if the first part is an F, you automatically know that conditional is going to be true. And so that means that if you reject the second premise, you got to accept the first premise. So in other words, your only options are If you accept the first premise, in other words, your only options, if you want to reject the conclusion, is if you reject the second premise, you have to accept the first. If you reject the first premise, you have to accept the second one. There's no way to reject both at the same time, or you get a contradiction. So that's just how modus ponens works. If you don't like it, too bad. That's the way it works. Now, what does that mean? That actually means that if you deny the second premise, moral realism is true. If you say that's false, that means you have to accept as true the conditional. And the conditional makes it look like you're saying that you could only have moral realism if God existed. But that's a weird interpretation of the conditional. The conditional isn't really a good translation of what people are saying in ordinary language. So in other words, take a position like mine. I think moral realism is not true. Does that mean that I think that it could be true if God existed, or would be true if God existed? No, I don't think that. And I'm totally comfortable saying that the first premise is true. Like, hey, if God doesn't exist, moral realism is false. I don't have a problem with that, because I think moral realism is false regardless of whether God exists. But notice how that term, if you plug it into the logic, and it's just like if not P, then not Q. If you plug it into the logic, it ends up having that funny structure of how conditionals work. And there's good reasons for why conditionals work that way. But the natural language version of that, if God doesn't exist, moral realism is false, or objective moral values and duties don't exist. The way that that's phrased, carries a pragmatic implication that if God does exist, then moral realism could be true or would be true. And that wouldn't follow on my view. So technically, I agree, hey, if God doesn't exist, moral realism is false. But I also think if God exists, moral realism is false. It doesn't matter to me. But you can't capture that with the sort of standard conventions of just a sort of like basic propositional logic. You're just not going to be able to get there with that. And that's okay. There are limitations to sort of standard characterizations of logic. It's not going to capture every single thing you possibly want to say in ordinary language. It's not intended to do that. It doesn't function to do that. That's why there's more advanced forms of logic. Totally fine. The problem is that this person may be giving the implication that atheist philosophers are on board with thinking moral realism requires God. I don't know if they're doing that or not. If all they're saying is, hey, because moral realists accept the second the idea could be this, and this would be a completely reasonable thing to say. Hey, if you're dealing with a moral argument for God, and it's a standard two-premise syllogism, and they accept the premise that moral realism is true, they're going to have to reject, if they want to be logically consistent and still be an atheist, they're going to have to reject the conditional. They're going to have to say that that's false. And what does that look like? That looks like you're sort of wait. So if they're accepting that realism is true, then they could deny the second premise. Yeah. So what would be the problem there? Because I'm the one that has the problem. Yeah, I don't see how this is going to work for them. Yeah, I was walking myself through this and I realized I'm making a mistake. Here would be the thing. If most philosophers were moral anti-realists, then most philosophers, when given the modus ponens, would have to accept as true the conditional. And then you could say, yeah, most of them accept this. But most of them are actually realists. So if they accept the second premise, then they could just reject the first premise without a problem. In fact, if they wanted to be consistent, they would have to. So actually, I don't think this is true even in the technical respect. So this isn't true in the non-technical respect or the technical respect. So no, they're not going to agree with this. That's cool. Okay, so this is even more objectionable than I thought. What I thought was there was an interpretation of this remark that would be objectionable, but there's like a technical sense in which it's true. But it's actually objectionable in both respects. So that's even worse. Oof, that's bad. Okay.
And even if atheists may claim that morality is subjective, almost nobody really believes it. Almost every...
Oh my God. This again. I didn't remember them saying this. Oh my God. Okay, let's play it again so I can be angry twice. All right. I don't know why do I do this to myself? All right.
Atheists may claim that morality is subjective. Almost nobody really believes it. Almost everyone has this sense and lives.
Let's go over the problems here. Hold on. Sorry. And now I'm like messing up the video because this gets me so upset. All right. Let's start this over again.
I think most atheist philosophers would agree that morality is not objective if God does not exist.
No, they wouldn't.
And even if atheists may claim that morality is subjective, almost nobody really believes it.
Okay, they might claim it, but they don't really believe it. So are they liars? So, hey, anybody that disagrees with me is just a big old liar. What kind of philosophy is that? Imagine if I said this. Okay, I'm an external world skeptic. I don't think there is an external world. Now, a lot of people might claim there's an external world, but nobody really believes that. So so they say it, but what they say isn't what they really believe. How do you know? Can you read minds? What's the argument for that? How do you know? Are you reading their mind? You know they're lying? Or is it that the way they act shows they're really realist? Because it's the performative contradiction nonsense again. This idea that you can't act like an anti-realist. What's the difference? What can an anti-realist not do? They're not a bunch of agent relativists. It's not. Because if you said, hey, if you're an anti-realist, then you think if someone wants to steal from you, it's okay for them. In fact, it's good for them to steal from you. So you have to let them. And you wouldn't let them, so you don't live like that. They didn't say that, but that is absolute. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. And this has to stop. That I'm not saying there is a controversy. Some people think this is true. Some people think this is not. That is straight up false. It's straight up bullshit. It's bullshit to the point that it's offensive that someone would make such an intellectually vacuous, ridiculous remark as to imply that if you're a moral anti-realist, you would have to be okay with people stealing. That is not true. It's not true. It's not true. I don't even know what else to say about it other than it's ridiculous. But more generally speaking, if you're an anti-realist, it does not carry any entailments about what you should or shouldn't do or what you have to do. An anti-realist can do anything. They can do anything. It's consistent with any course of action. There's some stuff that they couldn't say, and if you want to count that as stuff to do, then say, okay, they could do anything with an asterisk. There's a few things they couldn't do that would be consistent with being an anti-realist. So if you're a moral anti-realist, you can't consistently say, I think moral realism is true. That would be inconsistent. That'd be false. But in fact, actually, there's probably ways in which an anti-realist could say that, and it could be true. So there would be ways of threading that needle. I wouldn't find them plausible. So let's just grant them, okay, yeah, an anti-realist can't, in the sense of like consistently with their position, say realism is true. And they can't say it's like specific things are objectively true. So they couldn't say like lying just for fun is objectively wrong. They can't say that consistently with being a realist, or sorry, an anti-realist. Okay, so they can't say certain things. Wow. Okay, there's nothing to do with how they treat people, how they act, what laws they vote for, none of that. No implications. People can totally 100% live like an anti-realist. I do every damn day. Look, I'm doing it right now. I'm being an anti-realist right now. There are no contradictions. I'm not doing anything I'm not saying anything. I'm not doing anything that is inconsistent with being a moral anti-realist. This idea that you can't act like an anti-realist is complete nonsense. It's nonsense. Nonsense.
Everyone has this sense and lives as if morality.
Everyone has the sense. Citation, please. So people just say everyone has a sense. Okay, you know what? Everyone has a sense that anti-realism is definitely 100% true. Everyone has the sense. So if you say you don't have the sense, people could say that, but they don't really believe it. Everyone knows that anti-realism is true. What kind of arguing is this? Just asserting everyone agrees with you secretly. They all sense the world in the way you do. How the hell do you know? How do you know that? How do you know that? Where is the empirical evidence that shows all humans have the same phenomenology about realism and they all detect moral facts or their moral detection antenna, beep, 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 detect the facts. So maybe you think you're doing that. Doesn't mean I think I'm doing that. Doesn't mean it feels like I'm doing that. Doesn't mean anyone else is doing that besides the people that say that they're doing this. And who are those people? The 228 philosophers that responded that are specialists in metaethics. This 1,735 or whatever that answered the question. That's what, less than 1,000,000% of the world's population, or 1,000, whatever, 10,000, I don't know. It's not a lot of people. It's not a lot of people. How many other people are moral realists? Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. Again, that doesn't. People go, oh, so they're all anti-realists? Oh, right, because the only options are to take position. So imagine if I said, hey, and in fact, I will say this: most people do not endorse the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Does that mean they all endorse hidden variable views? Does that mean they're all a bunch of mini worlders? No, they're not any of those things. They don't have views about this. Why would people have views about how to interpret quantum mechanics? They don't know about this, and even if you told them about it, they probably wouldn't care. And for good reason. What does it matter for what they're trying to do? Why wouldn't you think of morality in the same way? When you go about making judgments about morality, what are you trying to do? You're trying to get stuff done. It's not about being correct. Like, there's this idea, why would people disagree about morality if they weren't realists? You would only disagree if you were disagreeing about what was... What? Okay, when you disagree about something, okay, you want to buy something. You go to the store, you go to a car to buy a car. You want to buy a car. We'll go with the price realism stuff. We use car examples for it. You want to buy a car. You only got 5,000. You're like, hey, I'll give you 5,000 for this car. And they're like, I want 8,000. You're like, 5,000. You disagree about what you should be spending on the car. You disagree with is there a fact of the matter? Is the only way to make sense of a dispute about the price of the car. You want to pay less. They want to charge more. Is that there is an objective fact of what the car costs, and you're both trying to figure out what that fact is? Is that how you're deliberating about the issue? No. No one's like, oh, what did my intuition tell me the car's really worth? No, you want to pay less. They want to pay more. If they offer the car for $4, you'd probably pay it, right? Because you want to pay as little money as possible. What you have there is a conflict of goals, not a conflict of beliefs. Disagreements are frequently conflicts of goals, not beliefs. It's not that you disagree about what's true. You both agree about what the car is. You both agree that money exists and the car exists, and that you want the car and they want to sell the car and you want to buy. You're agreeing on all the non-monetary facts, the non-economic facts. You agree on all of them. You might even agree on the monetary facts. You might even agree, hey, I know the blue book value of the car is X, but I want to pay less because that's what I'm willing to offer. So you don't have to think that there's an objective price that's correct. And even if there was, why would you want to pay that? So let's say let's say there was price realism is true. The objective value of the car is 6,000. Does that mean you have to want to pay 6,000? No, you'd still want to pay $4, wouldn't you? If that was an option. So your desires are disconnected from these objective facts. They just don't regulate your actions. You know what regulates your actions? Your goals, what you're trying to do. You want to pay less money. That's what you want to do. And that's what the discussion is about. So disagreements, I'll give another one that I frequently give. Another disagreement. You're sitting with a group of friends. Hey, everybody, let's order some pizzas. You got one friend who's a vegan and one friend who doesn't like mushrooms and one friend that is like, they're like, I want the meat lover everything. And they're going to be a real jerk about it. You have all these people, like you're going to argue. Well, no, we're not doing the meat lover thing and we're not going to do mushrooms. Can we get onions? Does everyone like onions? And then everybody does like onions. So you get the onion pizza or whatever. Right. And like you order multiple pizzas because the one person's a vegan and the other people don't want like a vegan cheese or whatever, or no cheese. So what are you doing there? You have a coordination problem. No one is disputing what the facts are. No one's like, what is a pizza? No one's going, do onions exist? People don't just go around arguing about what's true. No one ever argues about just what's true. Even philosophers, I don't even think they just sit around arguing about what is true. No one just argues about what is true for its own sake. People argue about what's true or false about a given issue because they care about whether it's true or false, or they want to have an argument about it. They don't even have to care about whether it's true or false. They can just enjoy the argument for the sake of the argument. The point is, when people are arguing about some issue, it's not just the case that there is this undirected, disinterested view, uninterested, like disconnected, like goal of figuring out what's true. People try to figure out truths for purposes, for reasons. They're goal-oriented. Human action is goal-oriented. We're trying to do stuff. Disagreements typically arise out of disputes about what to do. People don't just disagree for no reason. You can get in an intellectual argument. I think there is life on Mars. Well, I don't. You can do that. But most disagreements in everyday life, I suspect, I haven't gone out and canvassed people. It's an empirical question. I don't even know, but I'm hypothesizing. See, that's what philosophers should be doing when they talk about what people do. They should hypothesize, and they should have the epistemic humility not to pretend they know how everybody thinks and everybody talks and what everybody does everywhere in the world in all 6,000, 7,000 plus languages in the world. They just know by thinking about it. I don't know by thinking about it, and I do study how people talk and think about this stuff, and I've studied lots of, and they haven't even studied it. So they're in a worse position than me, and I still don't have the audacity to go around making claims about how everybody in the world thinks. But I'll hypothesize about how I suspect everybody in the world thinks. And if I make the stronger claim, feel free to criticize me and I'll walk it back. I suspect most actual disagreements that occur in real world contexts are coordination problems. It's people that have, another way to put this is that they arise when people have differences in goals. And disputes about what's true are typically subordinate to disputes about what to do. So disputes are about what to do or what's true in the service of what to do. People argue for purposes because there's no point in having an argument if there's no, like, what are you getting out of the argument? People can, I think, argue for fun, and they don't actually care about whether it's true or false. They actually just want to argue for the sake of arguing or something like that, or to show off how smart they are, or to make someone they don't like look stupid. But the point is that in all these cases, they have non-truth-seeking goals. They have some other goals. There's always, in other words, what I'm saying is, I suspect when people are arguing, they're arguing at least in part, in every case, for some reason other than simply wanting to know what's true for the sake of it. There's some other reason. Now, I'm fine with saying that's not always true. It doesn't have to be a universal, but I do think it's probably usually true. And I think that matters because when philosophers talk about moral disagreements, they center it. They'll say stuff like it wouldn't even make sense for two subjectivists to disagree about a moral issue. So I think moral facts are just my preferences. You think moral facts are just your preferences. We're trying to build a society together. It doesn't make sense for us to disagree about whether we should have a law against lying or whatever, but I'm just telling you my preference and you're telling me your preference. What are we disagreeing about? There's no fact that we're disagreeing about. Okay, well, if we're trying to build a system and we're trying to decide what the law is going to be, it's exactly like the case of we both have to order, let's say it's you and one friend, there's two of you. You have to order one pizza and you get to choose one topping for the pizza. You got to compromise. You could fight them and get the pizza just for yourself, but assuming you want to compromise, you're going to pick a topping that is acceptable to both of you. And that's going to be a discussion about coordinating your goals so that you both can compromise and get something that roughly you want. When people disagree, it's about coordinating their goals much of the time. And this makes perfect sense of subjectivists disagreeing. They have different goals. And does this make sense in economic situations? Just view morality as an extension of economic situations. What's the problem? I think there isn't one. So I don't see anti-realists having any problem handling disagreements. I think that philosophers have a goofy notion of how they're centering what disputes are about, as if people are just like, I think it's true. Well, I think it's not true. I think it's true. And that's just, I don't think that they're appreciating the reality of actual human action and how humans actually do things.
He is objective. Now, just because belief in God can epistemologically justify objective morality, that doesn't mean religious people will always agree on what's moral.
Notice the redundant language, epistemologically justify. Would there be some other sense of justifying in this context? There's no reason to throw in random philosophy terminology.
The atheist could say that Christians have disagreed on slavery, which they absolutely have. Christians have disagreed on many moral issues. Religious people of all kinds have.
See, this is where they take it. Everybody's a realist, and then they want to move to normative ethics, and then the Christians will defend that the Bible doesn't really say that, or actually it's consistent with God's nature to allow for that in some cases. They just move it over to normative ethics, and the anti-realists, whether they're atheists or whatever, just shouldn't give them the ground. So this is all the stuff where it's someone starting the discussion. Yeah, anti-realists have to concede a whole bunch of stuff to us, and then let's move into the normative ethical disputes. And there's like disagreements in there. No, we shouldn't concede the other stuff. I don't know if there's more to listen to here. We'll see.
Disagreed on moral issues. But if you believe in God, you at least have a foundation to say morals are objective, and therefore we can impose.
Why? So I don't think realism is true. I don't think it would be true if God existed. What God gives you a foundation? People throw this terminology out there: foundations, grounding, all this stuff. How? What are they talking about? And then they'll say it's God's nature. So people will say, and I really want to, and I'm not saying they don't necessarily mean something by this, but people will say God is the good. What? What does that mean? God is the good? That, like, interpreted literally, that just sounds like straight gibberish. So it must be non-literal. So what's the non-literal interpretation of that? What does that mean? God is the good. And also, if there's a non-literal interpretation, why use this weird, almost like literary language? It's almost poetic. God is the good. It sounds like some Deepak Chopra shit. Does it not? It sounds like nonsense. God is the good. What the hell is that? Just say what you mean. Because if you mean that, that's nonsense. So what do you mean? I'm not saying they don't mean something, but why phrase it in such a goofy way?
Morals and other people. The moral argument is basically, because people on Earth disagree what's right and wrong is, then can something be objectively right or wrong? The only way it can be objectively right or wrong is if there is supreme authority, which is what we would call God. Like in a culture, like let's say 90% of a culture believes it is good and right to horribly persecute the 10%. You would have the majority agreeing on a certain moral value. Would that make it right. Most people instinctively would say no. So I think the moral argument is a pretty good argument for God. Now, the atheist could say that, yes, even if we feel like morality is objective, that doesn't...
No, we don't even feel like morality is objective. At least I don't. I mean, who is we? Like, I take it by we. Most people, all people, I think all people feel this way. No, they don't. Most people feel this way. No, they don't. Some people feel that way. How many? I don't know. I don't think they know.
I mean, it's true. Like one of the fallacies, or maybe it's one of the cognitive biases, is like a just world hypothesis. Just because like we feel it ought to be true doesn't mean it is true. And they have a good point there. Next is...
Okay, that's it. Oh, well, consciousness, another topic I cover, but today is just metaethics, so I'm done with that one. Okay, so that's enough videos for today. I can't do 15 videos in one video. So I reviewed a lot there. I think I got a little quicker than some of my previous ones, but let's just wrap it up with what people have said in the comments, and then I'll close things out while I'm ahead. All right. Arguments directed at, or sorry, questions directed at chat. Okay, well, someone says this. Patrick says, Lance, you could try like beer and philosophy branding to make it more approachable, something like philosophical craft beer. Yeah, so there's a podcast that I listen to. I think it's called Two Psychologists, Four Beers. I can't remember. I listened to it, but I don't remember the name of it. Give me 1 second. Let me look it up. Yeah. So Two Psychologists, Four Beers. And part of the theme for that is that the hosts and the guests, at least usually, I mean, maybe they've had guests on that don't drink beer. But like typically they like feature beers. They'll be like, oh, listeners of the show send us this beer, so we're trying this one, or I have a favorite beer. I would love to do that because I love craft beers. My favorite beer for a while now has been La Chouffe, which I don't know if people think that's a great beer or not, but I love it. It's a Belgian. I don't know what kind of beer. I don't know. I'm not super knowledgeable about beer. Let's choose. What kind of beer is that? Belgian blonde beer. And it has like a little gnome. It's great. I love it. So I could totally do one philosopher, 4 beers, maybe. I don't know. I guess I'm a psychologist too. I got the degree. And here I am talking about metaethics all day. Although I brought up some psychology, so I kind of do it. Now I work in psychology still. But I don't know if it's what, I don't know how much people are going to get fired up if I start talking about like measurement and free will scales or something, which is like something I'm working with right now. Yeah, so I could do that. I've also thought about doing some kind of baking show because I like baking. Doesn't mean I'm good at it. So I like drinking beer. Doesn't mean I know a lot about beer. Although if I did something like that, I would learn. I would never be a specialist. Same thing with the baking. I am impatient and bad at time management. And so that makes baking difficult. Like bread is tough. I like proving is, I've done it like a couple times and I don't eat. So I mostly like pastry because I don't have to prove things. So I like baking, and I've thought about integrating that into the show. And I've come up with like slogans and mottos and names for that as like a separate YouTube channel if I ever ended up doing that. And it's like an actual serious consideration. The main thing stopping me is one, just inertia. It's just hard to move in that direction. And the second is I am still waiting to get a new camera. This camera, as you know, it like shuts off like every 10 minutes, like it'll just shut off for a couple seconds. I haven't been able to fix that. I don't know what the problem is. I think someone said, hey, they speculated on what the technical issue was. I didn't understand and I don't know how to fix it. So I don't have a good setup. This room is just my broken closet and like a crappy window. This is not a good setup. Everybody else, like you saw, Capturing Christianity has always had this really awesome like background and setup and video quality and audio quality. It's always great stuff. So before I did something like a baking show, I'd have to move in that direction, but I could start with the beers. When I first started the channel, I would often, I think there's a few times I baked stuff or like my family, like we would have some food and then I would bring it in. Like, what did we have? Flan a couple times or puchinji. So yeah, I did that the first few times. Mostly I was playing on the gastronomic realism, like jokes and themes. And I've moved away from that because it became too challenging to constantly be ready to bake. We did bake some stuff this week. I have a strawberry blueberry cobbler, but it's not very pretty, so I wouldn't want to bring it in. I would just go eat it. We have some cheesecake. So what else do we have? Oh, and we had, so it was someone's birthday this week, and we had like a chocolate cake. So that's too many desserts in 1 week. But yeah, integrating something more approachable might be a good idea. Miko says La Chouffe is nice. It is nice. I love it. Some other ones I frequently drink. Is it? I don't know. It's Kostritzer. That's another one I like. I got it when I was younger. My dad used to get it, and then I tried it and I loved it. So that's another favorite. I don't know the name of that. I think that's the name. Kostritzer. I don't know. If you know how to pronounce that, let me know. I actually was about to say, if you know how to pronounce it, like explain in the chat, which I guess maybe there's ways of doing that, like explaining the phonemes or something. But I think I was imagining that someone would pronounce it in the chat, as if you get the idea. That would be silly. Lance, could do gastronomic realism about beers to test the waters. I could, yeah. So I've thought about, and like in another life, like if I think, what would I do in another life? Oh no, I totally just kicked my desk. Sorry about that. What would I do in another life if I wasn't doing this? And I wasn't doing, like, basically every paper I write is here's why you're wrong. And it's either some philosopher and I'm like, here's why they're wrong, or it's some psychology paper, which often have multiple authors. And I'm like, here's why they're all wrong. So those are the two things I write, why everybody else is wrong. Doesn't mean I'm right about anything other than how wrong everybody else is. So I'm not going to have a lot of friends. So, one thing I've really considered is like, absolutely, like I love food to a level that it would be like, I take photos of all the food that I eat when I go places. I love trying new things. I have this kind of like a love of trying new things. I love to try new and unusual, and I really like underrated things that people don't give a lot of love to, or at least don't give a lot of love to where I am. They might be beloved somewhere else. So there's certain flavors from around the world that I've tried that I'm just like, this is awesome. So like one of my favorite is yuzu. I absolutely love it. Put it in everything. So I'm a big fan of that. What else? There's so many that it would be unreasonable to try to list them all. But yeah, I really like it. I don't think I could ever be a great chef just because of my personality, like my disposition. It's too scatterbrained. So the idea for a cooking channel was my wife's idea, because the idea was this happens a lot if I'm making dinner. Let's say I'm making dinner, just like something that I've got to like stir the pot, like some kind of stir fry kind of thing, and I've got to move stuff around with a spoon or a spatula or whatever. And I'm talking to her, I'm like, oh, do you know what somebody said online? Somebody said that realism entails blah blah blah. And what won't happen is that I'll keep cooking, and I'm like, so someone said this, and then I continue to like multitask and attend to the cooking and attend to the talking philosophy. I will take the spatula out and start like, and then they said this, and blah, 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 and I'm like flinging food all over. And then I will monologue for 10 minutes, and then she'll be like, food? Is it burning? So I have this like one track, like it's got thing. And her idea was that it would be funny for me to try to cook while talking about philosophy and psychology and whatever. And hopefully maybe there's a secret motive, which is to get me to get better at multitasking. That would make sense. And it would be good. So I'd love to do that. So it's definitely on the table, but I'm more of an idea person than an execution person. It's not surprising for someone that talks about the kind of stuff. I'm more theory than practice. That doesn't mean I don't love the practice. It's more challenging for me. I don't have a natural knack for it. So I can come up with cool flavor ideas for foods, but actually implementing them is difficult. The biggest difficulty for me is presentability. So I can make a big sloppy mess of like a pasta dish or something like that. But if you wanted something presentable, I wouldn't be doing great on this like chef challenges. They'd be like, what? This looks horrible. And they might taste it. They might say, this is good. If I didn't burn it because I started thinking about something, So if I didn't manage to ruin my food by forgetting what I was doing and walking into another room and arguing with someone on Facebook for 3 hours, if I didn't manage to do that, it might taste good, but it's not going to look good. Okay. But yeah, but for real though, that is a possibility on the table. And part of what I would love to do is to bake things that maybe people aren't so familiar with or aren't aware of. Like one of my favorite desserts is quinjean. It's really great. So they're popular in Brazil. Never seen them have I seen them in the US? I don't know. But I like quinjean. Yeah, and I don't know, maybe some other time I'll talk more about desserts. But yeah, I really love desserts. All right. Yeah, Patrick says too many desserts in 1 week. What? Yeah, I'm not active enough to justify eating all that stuff. All right, so that covers everything everybody said. Does anyone have, because I'd like to give people the opportunity, do you have any final questions, comments, remarks, criticisms, anything you want? I guess I'll just say now, if you like this stuff, like the video, share the video with people, talk about the video, leave a comment, ask me questions. I do my best to try to answer them. I don't always answer all of them. There was a stream 2 or 3 weeks ago where I'm like, I'll answer your questions, and then I just didn't. And it's too late now, and now I feel awkward about going back and doing it. Kind of like if someone emailed you and you didn't answer for like a month, you're not going to, most of the time you don't answer. But what was I talking about? Yeah, so final questions, anything like that. Please get them in. I'll give you a couple minutes. Okay, so I did get this one question. What do you think is the best argument for God? I haven't thought about it a whole lot, but what I can say is a lot of the ones that are more abstract don't resonate with me very much. So like ontological argument or something, those always seem to me like there's just something sneaky going on. The one that I think is interesting, I don't know if it's cool. They make you think, but I don't know if they're good. And I don't know if there's good responses to them because I don't really study a whole lot of philosophy of religion. So at some point I'll have to talk to someone that I know that does more philosophy of religion, like Joe Schmidt or Danny from Phil Talk. Maybe somebody would have a better sense. But fine-tuning arguments, I feel like there's ways of responding to them. I've even discussed it, I think, once or twice. I don't know if I have in some live stream or something. But I don't feel like if I give an answer to those that I'm like, yeah, that takes care of the issue. It's kind of like, yeah, I think my answer's on the right track. I think you could handle these and be an atheist. I don't think you're compelled to be a theist. But I'm not really studied enough or prepared enough to address those questions. My focus is very narrow. It's basically stuff that pisses me off about moral realism and like croissants. Those are my two things. You never see me eating them here, though. I wouldn't eat them here because I would get crumbles everywhere. So I try to be careful about that. Okay, so I think that's it. Everyone. Oh no, another question. Okay, that's not an objection. It's just when I'm like, okay, no more. No one has any questions, and then the question comes in. Austin Mussolf says, "Hey Lance, would you be willing to stream this live on TikTok as well?" I absolutely would. So. That's another thing. I think I started adding links to this. Let me check. I think I did. I'm going to say I know I did, and then we're going to see if I turned out to be right. So, 1 second. Oh, I really screwed things up. One moment. I'm just trying to check on my other screen whether I included a link to my TikTok in the description of the video. Did I do so? I did. In fact, I put it right near the top. So I do have a link there for following me on TikTok. I also have a blog. So I never know how many people are returning viewers or not. But I do have a blog. I blog a lot. So I think I'm at like 180 posts, and I started a year and a half ago. So that's a lot. So it was a post every 3 or 4 days or something. I don't know. I'm not going to do the math. But so that's pretty active. I took a hiatus from the channel and from the blog for like a couple months. But I'm back on both, and there's lots of stuff coming up on the blog. I keep saying that I have this backlog of like giant posts that it will take like weeks to roll out, like all the parts of them. And you're seeing that with the folk philosophy fallacy. It's got 5 parts, and we're coming up on the 5th one next week. So you'll be getting some new stuff. I have to decide which one of my like 40-page blog posts I'm going to split up into 5 posts and post there. So check out the blog. I do have stuff if you like what I'm doing and you like, when I started the channel, I was like, I would live stream on a weekend, every weekend. And I felt awkward. Like, oh, I write a blog post once in a while and I live stream. But if you like what I'm doing, you can support me. I do have a Patreon. I'm eventually going to be upgrading it. I'm talking with a friend of mine now who's helping me organize how to upgrade it. But right now it's bare bones. It's just like support if you want to support what I'm doing. There's nothing special for the higher tiers. But if anybody wants to support what I'm doing, I am not going to say no. So, you know, if I could get more, you know, out of this, then I would love to do that. But it's not the sort of thing where I feel really awkward and I'm pushing through that. Like, I don't think there's a problem with saying, hey, if you want to support me. Yeah. So if you do, go for it. I also am on Blue Sky. It's a new social media thing. I posted there a little bit. I posted 4 or 5 posts. A couple of them are threads where there's like 20 posts. So you can check that out. I think they just opened it up to everybody. Before you had to get like a special invite, but I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm posting a little bit there. So if you do go on there, like, share, engage if you can, that'd be great. It's not super active right now. So, but the main thing is, so this question, would you be willing to stream this live on TikTok? I can't stream live on TikTok right now. So in order to join a person, so TikTok, you might know it has like these short videos, but it also has live streaming. So people will stream and like, it's for facilitating conversations. So you could go on there and talk if you want, but you could also like bring people up and talk to them. And if you haven't seen Danny's stuff, some people might not like it because Danny gets a little argumentative with guests, to put it mildly. But Danny will bring up guests and talk about mostly like whether God exists or not, or what the problem. You know, evil is a problem for God, and then people will come up and say, "No, it's not," or "I believe in God," and then Danny will argue with him. And you could just, you know, bring people up one at a time. You could have larger groups of people. So it's really a platform that allows for facilitating live discussions. I think you need to hit 200 people before you could join other people's lives, but you got to hit 1,000 in order to host your own. And I'm at like 560 right now or something. So not bad in terms of followers, but I got to hit 1,000 in order to host my own live streams. So I'm just going to need more followers on there. So it's just going to take time for me to build up that following. So yeah, I would absolutely stream on TikTok. I would also start on TikTok and then stream it to here. And part of the idea behind that would be very different than the current format, which is I'm reviewing videos. That would be realism, or people, you know, I might shift towards other topics. So I don't think metaethics is the most popular topic there, but I could argue with people about religion or whatever. I'm not a specialist, but it could be fun and interesting. And I don't have to like win. So just because I don't know, then that opportunity to learn. People come along and, you know, if someone schools me, great. And then I learn something. I'm saying great, I would still be embarrassed, but you know, that's so basically, yes, I would love to do that. I just got to get the followers to do it. Okay, LPQ Silver, this is great. You know, I'm ready to close things out because I'm done reviewing videos, but then people have questions and they're on a variety of topics. It's awesome. Okay, so off top. So this is LPQ Silver, says off topic maybe, but does qualitative allow or promote positions of what subjective experience is? Yeah, sure. It's just the view that certain kind of discourse in academic philosophy is not meaningful, or there's nothing meaningful to say about it. It doesn't prohibit you from having like a theory about subjective experience. So yes, it allows it. Jacob Earl says, seen much noise from theists regarding the development of AI and a potential godlike intelligence? Not from theists, but this is a topic that will be on this channel. And it is, you know, a big issue right now is what's going on with AI. Where is that going to go? How much of a risk does it pose to us? Some people believe it poses a rather massive risk. Some people believe it poses a more modest risk. And there's people that are there varying degrees of optimism about it. I do not fall in the camp of this is ridiculous and there's nothing to worry about. I think there's at least a little bit to worry about the potentially catastrophic risks of AGI. I think that's worth talking about, worth worrying about, and doing something about it. So how much is an open question. And my confidence there is my confidence is very low. The parameters for, is it 1% or 40% of like, we're all doomed or whatever. I don't know. I wouldn't give like some narrow judgment. Like it's 22% chance. Like I don't know. Okay. I think that's it. I love the variety of questions. So I appreciate that I get to comment on other stuff. That reminds me, I've been thinking about doing, if you've seen Kane B's channel, and if you haven't seen Kane B's channel, you really should. KB has better videos of metaethics than I do. So they're just great. So Kane B does AMAs, and I'm thinking about doing the same. I've always been worried if I invite people to ask me questions, that they'll ask me questions about topics I don't want to talk about, and then I'll have to ignore their questions, and then because I'm not going to answer them. If I don't want to answer the question, I'm not going to. And then it would be like, I get 100 questions and I only want to answer 4 of them. And then you just have a bunch of frustrated people. So I don't want that to happen. So maybe what I'll do is I'll post a short video just saying, hey, ask me questions, and I'll do a video responding to the questions, but I want them on these topics. And if you want to, because if you ask me like my favorite beer, I'm fine answering that. But there's certain things I would not talk about, and you're not going to get me to talk about them. So like if that happens, then I don't want too much of that. So I want to make the boundaries of what kind of questions I'm comfortable with clear, just so people don't ask questions that I'm not going to answer and then get frustrated when I don't want to answer them. Because, this is, I'm just stuff I don't want to talk about. And I'm not willing to talk about, like, KB will answer pretty much any question, which is, it's cool, but I wouldn't do that. Okay, so I think I'm going to close it out there. If you didn't get your questions in already, too late, ask them next time, post them in the comments, whatever. Thanks everybody for being here. And I will leave it there. So take care, everybody. See you later.